The sound of hammering echoed through number 4, Privet Drive at 7:30 in the morning, sharp and violent against the suburban quiet. Petunia Dursley stood frozen in the hallway, her thin fingers clutching the banister, as she watched her husband of 15 years install iron bars across her nephew's bedroom window. "Vernon," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "What are you doing?" Vernon didn't look up from his work, sweat beading on his purple face, as he drove another screw into the window frame. The drill bit shrieked against the metal. "Making sure the boy can't cause us any more trouble," he grunted, testing the strength of the bar with a sharp tug. "After what happened last night with the Masons," his voice rose to a bellow, "I won't have any more of that freakish business in my house." Petunia's mind reeled back to the evening before. The pudding. Mrs. Mason's screams. The owl crashing through their kitchen window, just as Vernon had been so close to securing the deal that would have made them wealthy beyond their modest dreams. And Harry, standing there with that look of terror and confusion, insisting he hadn't done anything while chocolate and cream dripped from their spotless ceiling. "The ministry letter said he can't use magic outside of school," Petunia said, watching Vernon move to install a cat flap in Harry's bedroom door. The sound of the saw cutting through wood made her wince. "He can't defend himself. This is exactly what he deserves," Vernon snarled, his small eyes glittering with satisfaction. 15 years I've fed him, clothed him, put a roof over his ungrateful head. And this is how he repays us? By ruining the most important business dinner of my career?" He held up the small rectangular opening he'd cut in the door. "3 times a day, Petunia. Small portions, morning and evening bathroom breaks. That's more than the little freak deserves." The iron bars caught the morning sunlight, casting prison-like shadows across Harry's room. Petunia could see her nephew sitting on his bed inside, his 12-year-old frame seeming impossibly small against the stark reality of his confinement. His green eyes, Lily's eyes, met hers through the bars, and she saw something in them that made her stomach lurch. Not anger or defiance, but a terrible, familiar resignation. For a moment, she was 9 years old again, watching her sister perform impossible things with a mere thought, seeing the wonder and fear in Lily's green eyes when the Hogwarts letter arrived. Different eyes, same shade, same expression of someone trapped between worlds. Vernon stood back to admire his handiwork, brushing sawdust from his hands. "There," he said, with deep satisfaction. "Let's see the boy cause any more trouble now. The Dursley family has a reputation to maintain in this neighborhood, and I won't have it ruined by a delinquent freak. Vernon, perhaps nothing." Vernon's voice boomed through the house, making the floorboards vibrate. "The boy made his choice when he humiliated us in front of the Masons. Actions have consequences, Petunia. It's time he learned that." Throughout the day, Petunia found herself drawn to Harry's door, despite herself. The cat flap served its purpose with mechanical efficiency. A plate of food pushed through at breakfast, lunch, and dinner, barely enough to sustain a growing boy. She could hear Vernon's satisfied chuckles each time he locked the flap shut again. The house felt different with Harry imprisoned upstairs. Quieter, yes, but not in a peaceful way. The silence pressed down on her like a weight, broken only by the occasional creak of floorboards from Harry's room and Dudley's complaints about being bored without his favorite target for casual cruelty. As evening fell, Petunia climbed the stairs to check that Harry was ready for his scheduled bathroom break. She found him sitting by the barred window, staring out at the darkening street. The iron cast deep shadows across his face, and she was struck by how much older he looked than his 12 years. "Harry," she said quietly through the door. He turned toward her voice, but didn't approach the cat flap. Yes, Aunt Petunia. The politeness in his tone, even now, made something twist painfully in her chest. It's time for... She stopped, unable to finish the sentence. Time for your evening bathroom privilege. The word stuck in her throat like poison. At midnight, the house settled into its familiar rhythm of sleep. Vernon's snores rumbled through the master bedroom, punctuated by Dudley's occasional snorts from down the hall. But Petunia lay awake, staring at the ceiling and listening to the sound of Harry moving restlessly in his cage upstairs. She thought of Lily's last letter, written hastily in the shadow of a war that seemed like a lifetime ago. If anything happens to us, please take care of Harry. He's just a baby pet. He'll need love, not just shelter. At the time, Petunia had resented the request, the assumption that she would sacrifice her normal life for Lily's abnormal child. But now, 15 years later, the words echoed with accusation. Had she ever given Harry love? Or had she simply provided the bare minimum of shelter while allowing Vernon to chip away at the boy's spirit year after year? The bars on the window seemed to mock her with their honesty. They were only making visible what had always been true. Unable to bear her thoughts any longer, Petunia rose from bed and padded silently up to Harry's room. Through the cat flap, she could see him lying on his thin mattress, staring at the ceiling. He wasn't asleep either. "Harry," she whispered. He sat up immediately, moving to the door. "Aunt Petunia, is everything all right?" The question nearly broke her. Even imprisoned, even after everything, he was concerned for her welfare. "Pack your things," she said quietly. "Only what you absolutely need. Be very quiet. I don't understand. Just do it, Harry. Please." 20 minutes later, she unlocked his door with hands that shook so badly she could barely turn the key. Harry stood waiting with his trunk, his owl Hedwig's cage in one hand and a small rucksack in the other. He'd taken her at her word. Only the essentials. "Where are we going?" he asked as they crept down the stairs, careful to avoid the creaky third step. "Somewhere safe," Petunia whispered back, though she wasn't entirely certain that was true. "Somewhere you'll be wanted." They loaded his things into the boot of her small car and drove through the empty streets of Little Whinging in silence. Petunia had memorized the directions months ago after receiving a Christmas card from the Weasley family, a gesture of kindness that had puzzled and touched her more than she'd admitted to herself. The Burrow, Ottery St. Catchpole, Devon. She'd never imagined she would need to find it. The drive took nearly 3 hours through winding country roads that grew progressively narrower and more rural. Harry dozed fitfully in the passenger seat, his head lolling against the window. In the green glow of the dashboard lights, he looked heartbreakingly young. Devon's countryside was a patchwork of fields and hedgerows in the moonlight, punctuated by the occasional farmhouse or village. As they neared Ottery St. Catchpole, Petunia felt her resolve wavering. What was she doing? What would she say to these people who barely knew her? How could she explain 15 years of complicity in her nephew's suffering? But then she remembered the iron bars, the cat flap, the look of resignation in Harry's eyes, and she pressed harder on the accelerator. The Burrow appeared suddenly around a bend in the lane, and Petunia had to brake sharply to avoid missing it entirely. The house rose before them in the darkness, like something from a fairy tale, a lopsided structure with wonky chimney stacks and a red roof that seemed to defy both gravity and architectural sense. Several stories high, it looked as though it might topple over at any moment, held upright by magic rather than engineering. Even in the darkness, she could make out the jumble of gnomes, chickens, and Wellington boots scattered across the front garden. "We're here," she said quietly. Harry stirred, blinking sleepily at the strange house before them. Where exactly is here? The Weasley family home. Petunia turned off the engine and sat for a moment, gathering her courage. Harry, I need you to know. What Vernon did today, with the bars and the... She couldn't say cat flap. It was wrong. It was cruel. And I should have stopped it years ago. Harry stared at her in the dim light from the dashboard. Aunt Petunia. I failed you, she said simply. I failed your mother. But I'm trying to make it right now. Before she could lose her nerve, Petunia climbed out of the car and walked up the winding path to the front door of the Burrow, Harry trailing behind her with Hedwig's cage. The door was painted a cheerful blue and decorated with what appeared to be a horseshoe for luck. She raised her hand and knocked softly, then waited, her heart hammering in her chest. Footsteps approached from within, followed by the sound of multiple locks being undone. The door opened to reveal a tall, thin man with receding red hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles. Arthur Weasley looked exactly as she remembered from the brief glimpse she'd caught of him years ago on platform 9 3/4, though perhaps a bit more careworn. Mrs. Dursley? Arthur's eyes widened in surprise, then immediately shifted to Harry standing behind her. Harry, what are you... Is everything all right? No, Petunia said, her voice barely steady. Everything is not all right. She faltered, then tried again. I need your help. Harry needs your help. May we come in? Arthur stepped back immediately, ushering them into the warmth of the Burrow's kitchen. The room was a symphony of organized chaos, with dishes washing themselves in the sink, knitting needles clicking away at what appeared to be a jumper, and a clock on the wall that showed not the time, but the locations and safety status of various family members. It was the most magical place Petunia had ever seen, and utterly, completely welcoming. Sit, please, Arthur said, conjuring additional chairs with a casual wave of his wand. I'll put the kettle on. Harry, you look exhausted. And Mrs. Dursley, you're shaking. As if summoned by magic, other members of the Weasley family began to appear. Ron came thundering down the stairs in his pajamas, his red hair sticking up at odd angles, his eyes wide with delight at seeing his best friend. Harry, what are you doing here? How did you... Ron, Arthur said gently. Perhaps Harry and Mrs. Dursley would like some tea first, and then they can explain. But Petunia found herself unable to wait. The words came pouring out of her like water through a broken dam. Vernon's escalating anger, the iron bars, the cat flap, 15 years of cruelty disguised as discipline. Arthur listened without interruption, his kind eyes growing more troubled with each revelation. When she finished, the kitchen was silent, except for the gentle ticking of the magical clock and the whistle of the kettle. Harry sat staring at his hands, and Ron looked as though he'd been struck. Mrs. Dursley, Arthur said finally, his voice careful and gentle. You did the right thing bringing Harry here. You did a very brave thing. For the first time in 15 years, Petunia allowed herself to cry. The warmth of the Burrow's kitchen enveloped Harry like a gentle embrace, so different from the cold efficiency of Privet Drive that he felt disoriented. Arthur Weasley moved with practiced ease around the magical space, summoning teacups from cupboards with casual flicks of his wand, while a kettle heated itself on the stove. The walls were covered with family photographs that waved enthusiastically, recipes that wrote themselves in flowing script, and a collection of Muggle batteries that Arthur appeared to be studying with great fascination. Dad? Ron's voice carried down from somewhere upstairs, followed by the thundering of feet on wooden steps. I heard voices. Is everything... Harry! Ron appeared in the kitchen doorway, wearing striped pajamas that had clearly seen better days, his red hair sticking up at impossible angles from sleep. His freckled face broke into an enormous grin when he saw his best friend, Then confusion clouded his expression as he took in the scene. Harry with a travelling bag, Aunt Petunia sitting stiffly at the kitchen table with tears on her cheeks, and the general air of crisis that hung over the late-night gathering. "What's going on?" Ron asked, moving to sit beside Harry at the scrubbed wooden table. "Not that I'm not brilliant to see you, mate, but it's past midnight and you look like you haven't slept in days." Harry opened his mouth to explain, but found himself at a loss for words. How could he possibly summarize the iron bars, the cat flap, the way Vernon's face had twisted with satisfaction as he installed Harry's prison? How could he explain that his aunt who had barely spoken a kind word to him in 12 years, had rescued him in the middle of the night? "Perhaps," Arthur said gently, setting steaming mugs of tea before them. "We should let Mrs. Dursley explain when she's ready. There's no rush." The kindness in his voice seemed to undo something in Petunia. She wrapped her thin fingers around the warm mug and stared into its depths as if seeking courage there. "My husband," she began, her voice barely above a whisper, "has always been difficult about magic, about Harry's world. But last night, after the incident with the house elf—" "Dobby," Harry interjected quietly. "His name was Dobby." Petunia nodded, though the name seemed to stick in her throat. "After Dobby ruined Vernon's business dinner, Vernon received a letter from your ministry saying that underage wizards cannot use magic outside of school, and he saw an opportunity." Arthur's expression grew increasingly grave as Petunia described Vernon's modifications to Harry's room. The iron bars across the window, the cat flap installed in the door for minimal food delivery, the bathroom privileges restricted to twice daily under supervision. Ron's face went white, then red with anger. "He locked you up like an animal," Ron said, his voice tight with fury. "Harry, why didn't you tell me in your letters?" "I couldn't," Harry said simply. "I wasn't allowed to send letters. And even if I could have, what would you have done?" "We'd have come to get you," Ron said immediately. "Dad would have—" "Ron's absolutely right," Arthur said, his mild voice carrying an edge of steel that Harry had never heard before. "If we had known the extent of the situation, we would have intervened long before now. Mrs. Dursley, I want you to know that what you did tonight, bringing Harry to safety, that took tremendous courage." Petunia's composure cracked again. "It wasn't courage," she whispered. "It was guilt. 15 years too late. But guilt nonetheless." The soft padding of bare feet on the stairs announced another arrival. A small figure appeared in the kitchen doorway, rubbing sleepy eyes with the back of her hand. Ginny Weasley, 10 years old and dressed in a nightgown decorated with tiny broomsticks, peered around the doorframe with curiosity. "Ginny, sweetheart," Arthur said gently. "Come say hello to Harry and Mrs. Dursley." Ginny approached slowly, her bare feet silent on the warm flagstones. Her red hair was plaited for sleep, but wisps had escaped to frame her face, and her brown eyes were wide with a mixture of shyness and fascination as she looked at Harry. She'd heard Ron talk about his famous best friend countless times, but seeing him here in her kitchen in the middle of the night lent the whole situation an air of adventure. "Hello, Harry," she said quietly, then turned to Petunia with the solemn politeness that children sometimes display toward troubled adults. "Hello, Mrs. Dursley. Are you all right? You look sad." The simple directness of the question nearly undid Petunia completely. When was the last time someone had asked about her well-being? When was the last time anyone in her family had shown such uncomplicated kindness? I'll be fine, dear," Petunia managed. "Thank you for asking." Arthur conjured another chair and a mug of warm milk for Ginny, who perched on the edge of her seat and continued to study their late-night visitors with unguarded curiosity. The kitchen fell into a comfortable silence, broken only by the gentle ticking of the magical clock on the wall and the soft whoosh of flames in the fireplace. Harry found himself marveling at the casual magic that filled every corner of the burrow. Dishes washed themselves in the sink with cheerful efficiency. A collection of knitting needles clicked away at what appeared to be a Weasley jumper, and somewhere upstairs he could hear the faint sound of a wireless playing a lullaby. Everything about the house radiated warmth and welcome, from the mismatched furniture that somehow fit together perfectly, to the family photographs that waved encouragingly from every surface. "This is incredible," Harry said quietly, watching a dish rag wring itself out and hang itself neatly on a hook to dry. "Your house is amazing." Ron beamed with pride. "Wait until you see it in daylight. Mum's got gardens growing everywhere, and there's a pond behind the house where we catch frogs. And the apple orchard is brilliant for flying practice." "Flying practice?" Petunia asked faintly. "On broomsticks," Ginny offered helpfully. "Ron's teaching me to play Quidditch. I'm getting quite good at catching the snitch, though I'm not supposed to fly without supervision yet." The casual mention of flying, of magic as a normal part of daily life, seemed to overwhelm Petunia. She sat very still, her hands wrapped around her tea mug, processing this glimpse into a world she'd spent 15 years trying to pretend didn't exist. "Mrs. Dursley," Arthur said gently, "would you like to use our flu network to contact anyone? Let someone know where you are." Petunia shook her head. "Vernon will assume I've taken Harry to my sister Marge in Majorca. He won't think to look for us here. And truthfully, I'm not ready to face him yet. I don't know what I'm going to say when I do." "You don't have to go back," Harry said suddenly, the words surprising even himself. "I mean, if you don't want to. If he hurts you too." The concern in Harry's voice, the genuine worry for her welfare after everything she'd allowed Vernon to do to him, broke something fundamental in Petunia's chest. She stared at this 12-year-old boy who looked so much like James Potter but had Lily's kind heart, and wondered how she'd managed to convince herself for so many years that he was anything other than an innocent child who deserved love and protection. "Harry," she said, her voice thick with emotion, "I'm so sorry. For all of it. For every time I looked the other way, for every cruel word, for every—" "It's all right," Harry said quickly, uncomfortable with her obvious distress. "You came for me when it mattered. That's what counts." Arthur watched this exchange with growing understanding. Here was a woman struggling with 15 years of guilt and regret, a boy who'd learned to expect so little that basic kindness overwhelmed him, and a situation that had been allowed to fester far too long. But there was also hope here, in Petunia's courage to finally act, in Harry's capacity for forgiveness, in the simple fact that they'd found their way to the burrow, where help was always freely given. "Well then," Arthur said, rising from his chair with decision, "I think the first order of business is getting everyone some proper rest. Mrs. Dursley, you're welcome to stay as long as you need. We've got plenty of room, and I know Molly will want to meet you properly in the morning. Harry, Ron can show you to his room. I'm sure you boys have plenty to catch up on." "Can I help Harry get settled?" Ginny asked hopefully. "I could show him where the bathroom is, and where we keep the extra blankets and—" "Ginny," Ron said with fond exasperation, "Harry's been here before. He knows where everything is." "But not for sleeping over," Ginny pointed out reasonably. "That's different. And anyway, I want to help." Harry found himself smiling for the first time in days. "I'd like that, Ginny. Thank you." As they made their way up the crooked staircase, Harry carrying his bag while Ron helped with Hedwig's cage, he marveled at the difference between this house and Privet Drive. The burrow seemed alive in a way that number 4 never had. Every creak of the floorboards spoke of love and laughter. Every family photograph told a story of joy and belonging. Magic hummed through the very walls, but it was a gentle, domestic magic that made daily life easier and more wonderful, rather than something to be feared or hidden. Ron's room was small and cluttered, with Chudley Cannon's posters covering every available inch of wall space and Quidditch equipment scattered across the floor. But the bed was comfortable, and the room was warm, and when Ron enthusiastically launched into a detailed account of all the things they could do together over the coming days, flying practice, exploring the surrounding countryside, denoming the garden, Harry felt a sensation he barely recognized. Safety. For the first time in his memory, he felt completely, utterly safe. Downstairs, Arthur was helping Petunia settle into the guest room that Molly always kept ready for unexpected visitors. The room was small but cozy, with a comfortable bed covered in a handmade quilt and windows that looked out over the peaceful Devon countryside. "Mr. Weasley," Petunia said, as Arthur prepared to leave her to rest. "Why are you being so kind to me? After everything I've allowed to happen to Harry, after 15 years of... Why aren't you angry with me?" Arthur paused in the doorway, considering her question carefully. "Because anger won't help Harry now," he said finally. "And because I think you've been punishing yourself far more thoroughly than anyone else ever could. What matters is that you found the courage to do the right thing when it counted most. That's not nothing, Mrs. Dursley. That's everything." As the burrow settled into sleep around them, Harry lay in Ron's spare bed and listened to the gentle sounds of a house full of love, the soft murmur of Arthur and Petunia's voices downstairs, the creak of old wood adjusting itself for the night, the distant hoot of an owl in the apple orchard. For the first time in his life, he was somewhere he truly belonged. And tomorrow, he thought drowsily, tomorrow he would wake up, somewhere he was wanted. The morning sun was streaming through the kitchen windows of the burrow when the flames in the fireplace suddenly roared to emerald life. Harry, who had been helping Ron feed the chickens in the garden, felt his stomach drop as a tall figure stepped gracefully from the green fire, brushing soot from his midnight blue robes with casual dignity. Albus Dumbledore stood in the Weasley kitchen, his silver hair and beard catching the morning light, his blue eyes, usually twinkling with gentle humor, grave with concern. At 111 years old, he moved with the careful grace of someone who had learned to husband his strength, but there was nothing frail about the power that seemed to emanate from his presence. "Good morning, Arthur," Dumbledore said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of serious purpose. "I trust you will forgive the early intrusion, but we have matters of some urgency to discuss." Arthur, who had been reading the Daily Prophet at the kitchen table, rose immediately. "Professor Dumbledore, of course. Please, sit. Can I offer you tea?" "Thank you. That would be most welcome." Dumbledore's piercing gaze moved past Arthur to where Petunia sat frozen at the table, her teacup halfway to her lips, her face pale with recognition and something that might have been fear. "Mrs. Dursley, it has been many years." Petunia set down her cup with hands that trembled slightly. "Professor Dumbledore." The sound of running feet announced Harry's arrival from the garden, Ron close behind him. Both boys skidded to a halt when they saw Dumbledore, their faces reflecting a mixture of surprise and apprehension. Harry in particular looked as though he was bracing himself for disappointing news. "Harry," Dumbledore said, his voice gentling slightly, "I am relieved to see you safe and well, though I confess, your sudden departure from Privet Drive has caused some considerable complications." "Complications?" Arthur asked, conjuring additional chairs around the table with a wave of his wand. "Professor, Harry was being imprisoned in his own home. Surely removing him from that situation was the right course of action. Indeed, the treatment Harry endured was unconscionable," Dumbledore agreed, settling into his chair and accepting a steaming cup of tea from Arthur. However, the magical protections surrounding his placement with the Dursleys are both complex and critically important. By removing Harry from number 4, Privet Drive, we may have inadvertently compromised his safety in ways that go far beyond mere physical comfort. Harry felt a familiar twist of guilt in his stomach. "I've made things worse, haven't I? I should have stayed." "No, Harry," Dumbledore said firmly. "The fault lies not with you, but with those who should have been protecting you and failed in that duty. However, we must now address the consequences of the situation as it stands." Petunia had been listening with growing unease, and now she leaned forward in her chair. "What consequences? What protections are you talking about?" Dumbledore studied her with those penetrating blue eyes, as if seeing not just the woman she was now, but the girl she had been, the sister of Lily Evans, who had once been torn between pride and jealousy over her siblings' magical gifts. "The night your sister died," Dumbledore said quietly, "she invoked the most powerful protection known to wizard kind. Her willing sacrifice created a barrier around Harry, a shield forged from love and sealed with blood. When you took Harry into your home, Mrs. Dursley, however reluctantly, you sealed that protection with the bond of family, the connection of shared blood." "I don't understand," Petunia said, though there was something in her voice that suggested she understood more than she was willing to admit. "The protection lasted as long as Harry could call the place where his mother's blood lived home," Dumbledore explained patiently. "While he remained under your roof, Voldemort could not touch him. The magic was so powerful that it extended beyond Harry himself. It protected your entire family from retribution." Arthur inhaled sharply. "And now that Harry's left Privet Drive?" "The protection has been broken," Dumbledore said simply. "Harry is once again vulnerable to direct magical attack, and the Dursley family has lost the shield that kept them safe from Voldemort's followers." The weight of this revelation settled over the kitchen like a heavy blanket. Harry stared at his hands, processing the idea that his presence had somehow protected the very people who had made his life miserable. Ron looked confused and angry, as if he couldn't understand why anyone would care about protecting the Dursleys after their treatment of his best friend. But it was Petunia who broke the silence, her voice sharp with something that might have been accusation. "You knew," she said, staring at Dumbledore. "All these years, you knew what Vernon was doing to Harry, and you did nothing because it served your purpose to keep him there." Dumbledore's expression grew even more grave. "I knew the Dursleys were not ideal guardians for Harry, but I believed that the protection afforded by your blood relation outweighed other considerations. I see now that my judgment was deeply flawed." "Flawed?" Petunia's voice rose, 15 years of suppressed anger suddenly finding voice. "You left a letter, Professor. A single letter explaining that my sister was dead, that I was expected to raise her child, that it was somehow my duty because we shared blood. And when I tried to refuse, when I tried to send him away, you sent me that howler." Harry looked between them in confusion. "What howler?" "Remember my last, Petunia," Petunia quoted, her voice thick with old resentment. "That's what your precious headmaster's message said. Remember the last letter my sister sent me, begging me to protect you if anything happened to her. How could I refuse after that? How could I turn away a baby when Lily's own words were echoing in my ears? Dumbledore bowed his head slightly. I manipulated your love for your sister to ensure Harry's placement remained secure. It was expedient, but it was not kind, and I regret the pain it caused you. Do you? Petunia demanded. Do you regret it? Because you had to have known what Vernon was like. You had to have known he would see Harry as a threat, an abnormality to be contained and controlled. Did you think love would somehow magically appear just because we were related by blood? The accusation hung in the air like a physical thing. Arthur shifted uncomfortably, clearly torn between his respect for Dumbledore and his growing understanding of the injustice that had been done. Ron looked as though he wanted to say something, but wasn't sure what, while Harry stared at his aunt with new understanding. You're right to be angry, Dumbledore said finally. I placed an enormous burden on you with little thought for your own well-being or your family's dynamics. I told myself that Harry's safety was paramount. But in truth, I was afraid. Afraid of what might happen if the protection failed, afraid of facing Tom Riddle, Voldemort, without that final safeguard. And now, Arthur asked quietly, what happens now that the protection is broken? Now we must find another way to keep Harry safe, Dumbledore replied. The old magic that protected him is indeed broken, but it need not be lost entirely. Mrs. Dursley, you remain Harry's closest blood relative. If you were willing to formally acknowledge him as family, truly family, not merely an unwelcome obligation, some measure of protection might be restored. Petunia looked across the table at Harry, this 12-year-old boy who had endured so much and yet had worried about her safety the night before, who had forgiven her failures with a grace she didn't deserve. What would that mean, exactly? She asked. It would mean choosing Harry's well-being over your husband's prejudices, Dumbledore said bluntly. It would mean acknowledging his world as part of your world, accepting that magic is not something to be hidden or suppressed, but something to be celebrated. It would mean standing between Harry and any who would harm him, just as your sister did. The kitchen fell silent, except for the gentle ticking of the magical clock and the distant sound of chickens clucking in the garden. Harry found himself holding his breath, afraid to hope that this conversation might somehow lead to a real family, a real home where he was wanted rather than merely tolerated. Vernon will never accept that, Petunia said quietly. Then perhaps, Dumbledore suggested gently, it is time to choose between your husband's comfort and your nephew's survival. The protection I speak of requires genuine love and willing sacrifice. It cannot be forced or feigned. Petunia closed her eyes, and Harry could see her struggling with the weight of 15 years of buried guilt and suppressed affection. When she opened them again, there was a resolve in her expression that he had never seen before. I should have chosen Harry years ago, she said. I should have chosen Lily. I was jealous and frightened, and I let Vernon's hatred poison what little love I had left for my sister's memory. She looked directly at Harry, her eyes bright with unshed tears. I can't undo 15 years of neglect, Harry. But if you'll let me, I'd like to try to be the aunt, the family, that Lily wanted me to be. Harry felt something tight in his chest begin to loosen. I'd like that too, Aunt Petunia. Dumbledore smiled for the first time since his arrival, and some of the familiar twinkle returned to his blue eyes. Love freely given has a power all its own, Mrs. Dursley. It may not provide the same absolute protection that your sister's sacrifice did, but it will not be without value. What about Vernon? Arthur asked. And young Dudley? Petunia's expression hardened slightly. Vernon made his choice when he put bars on Harry's window. As for Dudley, he'll learn to accept Harry as family, or he'll learn that his behavior has consequences. Either way, things are going to change. Change is rarely easy, Dumbledore observed, but it is often necessary. Harry, how do you feel about these developments? Harry looked around the kitchen, at Ron, whose friendship had been the first real love he'd known, at Arthur, whose kindness had been freely offered to a stranger, at his aunt, who was trying so hard to make amends for years of neglect, at Dumbledore, whose protection had been both blessing and burden. For the first time in his life, he felt like he had choices, like his voice might actually matter in decisions about his own future. "I feel hopeful," he said simply, and in the warm chaos of the Burrow's kitchen, with morning light streaming through windows and the promise of family, real family, hanging in the air like magic itself, hope felt like the most powerful protection of all. The peaceful afternoon at the Burrow shattered like glass when Vernon Dursley's company car came roaring up the narrow lane, its engine straining against the steep incline and its paint scratched by overhanging branches. Harry, who had been helping Ginny feed the chickens while Ron practiced Quidditch moves in the orchard, felt his stomach plummet as the familiar sound of his uncle's furious driving reached his ears. "Harry," Ginny said quietly, her 10-year-old face suddenly serious as she watched the black sedan screech to a halt in front of their house. "Is that—" "Uncle Vernon," Harry confirmed, his voice barely above a whisper. Even here, surrounded by magic and warmth and people who cared about him, the sight of Vernon's bulky form emerging from the driver's seat made Harry's chest tighten with old, familiar fear. Vernon Dursley looked apoplectic with rage as he surveyed the Burrow, his small eyes bulging as he took in the wonky chimney stacks, the chickens pecking freely in the garden, and the general air of magical chaos that clung to the Weasley home like morning mist. His purple face had deepened to an alarming shade of burgundy, and his thick neck strained against his collar as if he might explode from sheer outrage. "Petunia!" Vernon bellowed, his voice carrying across the peaceful Devon countryside like a foghorn. "Petunia, get out here this instant!" The kitchen door burst open, and Arthur Weasley emerged, his wand held casually but ready in his hand. Behind him came Petunia, her face pale but set with determination, and Dumbledore, whose presence seemed to make the very air around the Burrow thrum with barely contained power. "Vernon," Petunia said quietly, but her voice carried clearly in the sudden stillness. "You shouldn't have come here." "Shouldn't have come?" Vernon's voice reached a pitch that made the chickens scatter in alarm. "My wife disappears in the middle of the night with a stolen car, kidnaps my nephew, and you think I shouldn't have come? I want explanations, Petunia, and I want them now." "I kidnapped no one," Petunia replied, stepping further into the garden, despite Arthur's gentle attempt to keep her behind the protective line of wizards. "I removed Harry from a dangerous situation, from prison bars and cat flaps and the kind of cruelty that would make decent people sick to their stomachs." Vernon's face twisted with incredulous rage. "Prison bars? Petunia, have you completely lost your mind? That boy was being disciplined for destroying my business dinner, for humiliating our family in front of the most important clients I've ever entertained. Everything I did was perfectly reasonable." "Reasonable." The word cracked like a whip from Petunia's lips. "Vernon, you installed iron bars on a 12-year-old's bedroom window. You cut a hole in his door and fed him like an animal. How is any of that reasonable?" "Because he's not a normal 12-year-old, Vernon roared, jabbing a thick finger toward Harry, who had emerged from behind the chicken coop with Ginny pressed protectively behind him. "He's a freak, Petunia. A dangerous, unnatural freak who brings nothing but trouble to decent, normal families. And you," Vernon's glare shifted to encompass Arthur and Dumbledore. You people with your freakish nonsense, you have no business interfering in how I discipline my own household." "Harry is not your household," Dumbledore said quietly, his voice carrying despite its gentle tone. "He is a child in need of protection, and Mrs. Dursley acted with admirable courage in providing it." Vernon's eyes narrowed as he took in Dumbledore's flowing robes, his long silver beard, the unmistakable aura of magic that surrounded him like morning mist. "And you're one of them, aren't you? One of the freaks from that freakish school." "Well, I've got news for you, old man. Your kind has no authority in the real world. In the real world, I have rights. Legal rights." "Indeed you do," Dumbledore agreed mildly. "However, you might find that exercising those rights proves more complicated than you imagine." "Is that a threat?" Vernon demanded, his face now approaching purple. "Because let me tell you something about threats, Grandad. I know people, important people, magistrates, social workers, police officers, and when I tell them that my wife has been brainwashed by a cult of freaks who practice unnatural rituals and corrupt children—" "Vernon," Petunia interrupted sharply. "Stop, just stop. I will not stop." Vernon's voice rose to a roar that made the windows of the Burrow rattle in their frames. 15 years, Petunia. 15 years I've provided for that boy, fed him, clothed him, put a roof over his ungrateful head. And this is how he repays us? By running away to live with more freaks and perverts? By abandoning the family that took him in when his own parents couldn't be bothered to stay alive? The cruel words hung in the air like poison, and Harry felt something inside him recoil as if he'd been physically struck. But before he could fully process the pain, before the familiar guilt could take hold, Petunia's voice cut through the silence like a blade. "How dare you!" Petunia's voice was deadly quiet, but it carried more force than Vernon's loudest bellow. "How dare you speak about my sister that way? How dare you speak about Harry that way? James and Lily Potter died protecting their son from a monster, Vernon. They died heroes. And you're nothing but a bully who gets his satisfaction from tormenting a child." Vernon stared at his wife as if she'd grown a second head. "Petunia, what's gotten into you? These people have clearly done something to your mind." "These people have shown me what a real family looks like," Petunia shot back. "They've shown me what it means to welcome someone with kindness instead of resentment. And they've shown me what it looks like when adults actually protect children instead of finding excuses to hurt them. I never hurt that boy. You locked him in a cupboard for 10 years. Petunia's composure finally cracked, and 15 years of suppressed guilt and anger came pouring out. "You starved him. Vernon, you made him do chores that would exhaust a grown man. You let Dudley use him as a punching bag, and when that wasn't enough, you installed prison bars on his window and fed him through a slot in his door like he was some kind of animal." Vernon's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water, his face cycling through various shades of red and purple as he struggled to find words. He's not normal, Petunia. He does freakish things, impossible things. The boy is dangerous. The boy," Arthur Weasley said quietly, "is a 12-year-old child who has shown more courage and kindness in the past 2 days than you've displayed in 15 years, and I think it's time for you to leave." "Leave?" Vernon's voice cracked with disbelief. "Leave? I'm not going anywhere without my wife and that boy. Petunia, get in the car. Now, we're going home, and we're taking the freak with us, and we're going to pretend this whole embarrassing episode never happened. No." The simple word fell from Petunia's lips like a stone into still water. "No, Vernon, I'm not coming with you, and Harry certainly isn't." Vernon stared at her, his face cycling through confusion, disbelief, and finally settling on a cold, calculating anger that was somehow more frightening than his explosive rage had been. "I see," he said slowly. "I see how it is. Well, Petunia, I hope you've thought this through very carefully, because when I go to the authorities, and I will go to the authorities, I'm going to tell them that my wife has been kidnapped by a dangerous cult. I'm going to tell them that a child in my legal custody has been abducted by criminals who practice illegal activities and corrupt minors. And we," Dumbledore said mildly, "will be forced to demonstrate to those authorities exactly what sort of illegal activities we practice. I suspect they will find our evidence quite compelling." Vernon's eyes narrowed. "You can't use your freakish tricks on normal people. The boy told me. There are laws, restrictions. You can't use magic on non-magical people without consequences." "Quite true," Dumbledore agreed. "However, those restrictions apply primarily to underage wizards like Harry. Adult wizards operating within the bounds of protecting a child from abuse have considerably more flexibility." The threat was delivered so gently, so politely, that it took Vernon a moment to understand what had just been said to him. When the meaning sank in, his face went through several interesting color changes before settling on a pale green. "You can't threaten me," Vernon blustered, but the conviction had gone out of his voice. "This is England, not some backward third-world country. We have laws here, proper laws. Indeed we do," Arthur said cheerfully. "In fact, I believe you'll find that child abuse is quite illegal under both magical and muggle law. Harry, would you mind showing Mr. Dursley your arms?" Harry hesitated, glancing at Petunia, who nodded encouragingly. Slowly, he rolled up his sleeves, revealing the faded but still visible marks from years of Dudley's casual violence and Vernon's discipline. Vernon's face went even paler as he realized what those marks might look like to outside authorities. "Those could have come from anywhere," Vernon said weakly. "Boys get bruises. It's perfectly normal. And the malnutrition," Arthur continued conversationally. "The isolation, the systematic psychological abuse. I'm sure a proper medical examination would reveal quite a lot about Harry's treatment over the years." Vernon stood frozen in the garden, his mouth working soundlessly as he tried to find some angle, some leverage, some way to reassert the control that had been his defining characteristic for so many years. But here, surrounded by magic and people who valued kindness over conformity, his usual weapons seemed powerless. "Petunia," he said finally, his voice smaller now, almost pleading. "Petunia, you're my wife. We're a team. We've built a life together, a good life. Don't throw it all away for him." For a moment, Petunia's resolve seemed to waver. Harry could see the conflict in her face, the weight of 15 years of marriage warring against her newfound determination to do right by her nephew. But then she looked at Harry, really looked at him, and saw not the burden she'd convinced herself he was, but a 12-year-old boy who had endured years of cruelty with remarkable grace. "We never were a team, Vernon," she said quietly. "A team protects each other. A team shares the load. You made all the decisions, set all the rules, and I went along because it was easier than fighting. But I'm done being easy, Vernon. I'm done pretending that cruelty is discipline and fear is love." Vernon stood in the garden for a long moment, his face cycling through rage, disbelief, and something that might have been genuine hurt. Then his expression hardened into the cold, calculating look that Harry had learned to fear more than his explosive anger. "Fine," Vernon said quietly. "Fine, Petunia. You want to throw away 15 years of marriage for a freak who isn't even grateful for everything we've done for him. You want to choose his kind over your own husband. That's your choice. But don't come crying to me when you realize what you've given up. Don't come crawling back when you discover that freaks don't take care of their own the way normal people do. He turned and stalked back toward his car, his heavy footsteps crunching on the gravel. At the driver's door, he paused and looked back. "You're making a mistake, Petunia," he called. "The biggest mistake of your life. And when it all comes crashing down, when these people get tired of playing house and dump you both back where you came from, remember that I tried to save you from your own foolishness." The car door slammed with a sound like a gunshot, and Vernon's sedan roared to life. A moment later, he was gone, leaving only dust and the lingering smell of exhaust in the peaceful Devon air. Petunia stood very still in the sudden quiet, her hands clenched at her sides. Harry could see her trembling, but whether from fear or relief or simple emotional exhaustion, he couldn't tell. "Aunt Petunia," he said quietly. "Are you all right?" She turned to look at him, and Harry was surprised to see that she was smiling. It was a small, uncertain smile, but it was genuine. "I think so," she said. "Yes, Harry. I think I'm finally all right." The morning of August 11th dawned bright and warm over the Burrow, with golden sunlight streaming through the kitchen windows and the sound of Mrs. Weasley bustling about the stove, humming under her breath as she prepared what appeared to be enough food to feed half of Devon. Harry had been staying at the Burrow for 10 days now, and he was still adjusting to the sheer abundance of everything: food, laughter, warmth, and most importantly, the genuine affection that filled every corner of the house like sunlight. "Happy birthday, Ginny," Ron called out as his sister appeared on the crooked staircase, still in her nightgown and rubbing sleep from her eyes. At 11 years old today, Ginny Weasley was all legs and elbows, with her red hair catching the morning light and her brown eyes bright with excitement, despite her sleepy appearance. "Is it really morning already?" Ginny asked, though she was grinning as she said it. "It feels like I just went to sleep." "It's 8:30, Mrs. Weasley said warmly, abandoning her cooking long enough to envelope her daughter in a fierce hug. "Happy birthday, sweetheart. 11 years old today. Can you believe it?" Harry watched from his place at the kitchen table, a piece of toast halfway to his mouth, and felt something strange and wonderful unfurling in his chest. He'd seen the Weasleys interact before, of course, but there was something different about watching a family celebration from the inside, as someone who belonged rather than someone who was merely tolerated. "Harry," Ginny said, sliding into the chair beside him with the easy familiarity that had developed over the past week. "Have you ever had a proper birthday party? With cake and presents and everything?" The question was so innocently asked, with such genuine curiosity, that Harry didn't have the heart to feel embarrassed by the answer. "No," he said simply. "The Dursleys didn't really celebrate my birthday." Ginny's face fell slightly, and Harry could see her trying to imagine what that might be like, to have a birthday pass unnoticed, uncelebrated. To her, birthdays were magical occasions full of love and attention and carefully chosen gifts. The idea of a birthday without joy was clearly beyond her comprehension. "Well," she said finally, with the sort of determination that reminded Harry powerfully of her mother, "then you'll just have to help me celebrate mine properly. It'll be like practice for when yours comes around next year." Before Harry could respond to this generous offer, the kitchen door burst open, and Fred and George Weasley tumbled through it, both talking at once in the rapid-fire way that made them nearly impossible to follow when they were excited about something. "Happy birthday, Ginnykins. We've got something special for you. Something we've been working on for weeks." Well, 3 days, but it felt like weeks. Shut up, George. You're ruining the suspense. At 14, the twins were tall for their age, with the characteristic Weasley red hair and an energy that seemed to crackle around them like electrical current. They moved with identical grins and an air of barely contained mischief that made Harry both nervous and delighted. "Boys," Mrs. Weasley warned, but she was smiling as she said it. "Whatever you've cooked up, it had better not involve anything that explodes, changes colour, or makes noise after 10 o'clock at night." "Mum," Fred said, pressing a hand to his chest in mock offence, "you wound us with your lack of trust." "Besides," George added cheerfully, "it only makes noise during the day." "Mostly." Mrs. Weasley's eyes narrowed suspiciously, but before she could interrogate the twins further, Percy appeared in the kitchen doorway. At 16, he was the most serious of the Weasley children, with his red hair neatly combed and his demeanour already showing hints of the bureaucratic precision that would define his adult years. But even Percy couldn't quite suppress his affection for his little sister on her birthday. "Happy birthday, Ginny," he said formally, but his smile was genuine as he handed her a carefully wrapped package. "I hope you like it." "Percy, you didn't have to get me anything," Ginny protested, but she was already tearing into the wrapping with the enthusiasm of an 11-year-old who had been anticipating this day for months. Inside was a beautiful set of quills, each one charmed to write in a different coloured ink, depending on the writer's mood. When Ginny picked up the first quill, it immediately began writing in a cheerful golden yellow that matched the excitement radiating from her face. "They're perfect," she breathed, testing another quill that produced elegant silver script. "Thank you, Percy." "They'll come in handy at Hogwarts," Percy said, his chest swelling slightly with pride at her obvious delight. "And they're charmed to never run out of ink, so you'll never have to worry about being caught without writing materials during exams." Harry watched this exchange with growing amazement. At the Dursleys, gift-giving had been a strategic exercise. Expensive presents for Dudley designed to prevent tantrums, and for Harry, usually nothing at all, or occasionally something broken that the Dursleys were throwing away anyway. But here, every gift was chosen with care, with genuine thought for the recipient's happiness and needs. My turn, Ron said, producing a small package wrapped in what appeared to be the comic section of the Daily Prophet. "It's not much," he added apologetically, "but I thought you'd like it." Ginny unwrapped the gift to reveal a small, carved wooden figure of a dragon. When she picked it up, the dragon spread its tiny wings and breathed a puff of harmless smoke before settling contentedly in her palm. "Charlie sent it from Romania," Ron explained. "He said it's carved from dragonwood, and it's supposed to bring good luck to anyone starting a new adventure." "Like starting at Hogwarts," Ginny said softly, cradling the little dragon in her hands. "Ron, this is wonderful. I'll treasure it forever." The twins exchanged a look that Harry was beginning to recognize as their signal for mischief about to be unleashed. "Right then," Fred announced, "time for our gift." "Fair warning," George added cheerfully. "You might want to step back a bit." George pulled a small, innocuous-looking box from his pocket and set it carefully on the kitchen table. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the box began to shimmer and grow, expanding rapidly until it was the size of a small trunk. "Frederick and George Weasley," Mrs. Weasley said sharply. "What exactly have you done?" "Nothing dangerous, Mum," Fred said quickly. "Just a bit of creative transfiguration, mixed with some charm work we've been perfecting." The box opened with a soft musical chime, and a cascade of butterflies poured out. Not real butterflies, but delicate constructs of light and magic that fluttered around the kitchen in a dazzling display of colour. They circled Ginny's head like a living crown, before settling into a pattern that spelled out "Happy Birthday" in glowing script across the ceiling. "Oh," Ginny breathed, her eyes wide with wonder as the magical butterflies danced around her. "Oh, this is the most beautiful thing I've ever seen." Harry found himself grinning as he watched Ginny's delight, but the smile faded slightly as he thought about his own birthdays. 11 days ago, on July 31st, he had spent his 12th birthday locked in his room at Privet Drive, eating stale bread through a cat flap and listening to the Masons' ruined dinner party echoing through the house below. The contrast was so stark it made his chest ache. "Harry?" Ginny's voice was soft with concern. "You look sad. What's wrong?" He realized that the entire family was looking at him now, their expressions varying from curious to worried. He felt heat rise in his cheeks, embarrassed to be the center of attention during Ginny's special day. "Nothing's wrong," he said quickly. "I was just thinking about birthdays, I suppose. I've never seen anything like this before." "What were your birthdays like?" Mrs. Weasley asked gently, though Harry could see the careful way she framed the question, as if she suspected the answer might be painful. Harry hesitated, looking around at their expectant faces. These people had welcomed him into their home, fed him, protected him, treated him like family. They deserved honesty, even if it made him uncomfortable. "The Dursleys didn't celebrate my birthday," he said quietly. "Usually they just pretended it wasn't happening. Sometimes they'd lock me in my room so I wouldn't interfere with their plans for the day. This year..." He gestured vaguely, not wanting to go into the details of bars and cat flaps on Ginny's special day. The kitchen fell silent, except for the gentle fluttering of the magical butterflies, still dancing around the ceiling. Mrs. Weasley's face had gone through several interesting color changes, settling on a dangerous shade of red that reminded Harry powerfully of her son's hair. "Well," she said finally, her voice carefully controlled, "that's going to change right now. Arthur." Mr. Weasley appeared in the kitchen doorway, his tie askew and his hair disheveled from his morning battle with a temperamental garden gnome. "Yes, dear?" "We're having another birthday party," Mrs. Weasley announced. "Harry's 12th birthday, to be precise. Today." "But, Mum," Ron protested, "Harry's birthday was 11 days ago." "Then we'll celebrate 11 days late," Mrs. Weasley said firmly. "Better late than never, and certainly better than not at all." "Mrs. Weasley," Harry began, "you really don't need to—" "Nonsense," she cut him off briskly. "Every child deserves a proper birthday celebration, and if you've gone 12 years without one, then it's high time we corrected that oversight." "A double birthday," Ginny exclaimed, clapping her hands together with delight. "Harry, we can share. It'll be even more special that way." Harry looked around the kitchen at the faces surrounding him, Ron grinning with excitement, the twins already plotting elaborate magical additions to the festivities, Percy adjusting his glasses with what might have been approval, Mr. and Mrs. Weasley beaming with parental pride, and Ginny practically bouncing in her chair with enthusiasm. For a moment, he was overwhelmed by the simple generosity of it all. These people, who had known him for only days, were willing to reorganize their daughter's birthday celebration to include him. They wanted to give him something he'd never had, not out of pity or obligation, but out of genuine affection. "Thank you," he said, quietly, his voice slightly rough with emotion. I'd like that very much." The rest of the morning passed in a whirlwind of activity, as Mrs. Weasley transformed the kitchen into a proper birthday venue. She enlarged the table with a casual wave of her wand, conjured decorations that included both Ginny's favorite purple and silver and what she declared to be Harry's colors of red and gold, and began baking what appeared to be enough cake to feed the entire village of Ottery St. Catchpole. The twins disappeared upstairs and returned with armloads of what they called party enhancement supplies, which turned out to be an eclectic collection of magical joke items, fireworks, and things that Percy eyed with deep suspicion. Ron contributed his collection of chocolate frog cards, which he arranged into an elaborate castle on the sideboard, while Ginny helped Harry string magical fairy lights that changed colour in response to the mood of people nearby. "Look," Ginny said, pointing to where the lights had shifted to a warm, golden glow around Harry. "They like you. They only turn gold for people who are really, truly happy." Harry touched one of the lights gently, marvelling at the way it pulsed brighter at his touch. "I think I am," he said, surprised to realize it was true. "Really, truly happy, I mean." As the day wore on and the celebration grew more elaborate, Harry found himself experiencing something he'd never had before. The simple joy of being celebrated, of being wanted, of being part of something larger than himself. When Mrs. Weasley presented them with 2 magnificent cakes, one decorated with tiny dragons for Ginny, and one with a golden snitch for Harry, he felt tears prick at the corners of his eyes. "Make a wish," Ginny said solemnly, as they prepared to blow out their candles together. "But don't tell anyone what it is, or it won't come true." Harry closed his eyes and thought about what he could possibly wish for, when everything he'd ever wanted was already happening around him. In the end, he wished for this feeling to last, for this family to remain his family, for this sense of belonging to be something permanent rather than temporary. When they blew out the candles together, their combined breath sending 12 small flames dancing into extinction, the magical butterflies from the twins' gift swirled around them in a spiral of light and colour. And as the Weasley family erupted into cheers and applause, Harry thought that maybe, just maybe, some wishes really did come true. The morning of their Diagon Alley trip dawned crisp and clear, with the sort of late August sunshine that promised autumn was just around the corner. Harry stood in the Burrow's kitchen, holding his Hogwarts letter in hands that trembled slightly with anticipation. After nearly 3 weeks of living with the Weasleys, the reality of returning to school, but returning as part of a real family, still felt almost too good to be true. "Now, everyone remember," Mrs. Weasley said, bustling around the kitchen with her usual morning efficiency. "We're meeting your father at the Leaky Cauldron at 10:30. Ginny, do you have your list? Harry, where's your letter? Ron, if you've forgotten your money again." "I've got it, Mum," Ron said, patting his pocket with the air of someone who had learned through bitter experience to double-check such things. "And I've got Harry's too, since his vault key is still—" He trailed off, glancing uncertainly at Harry. It was a delicate subject. Harry's Gringotts vault key was presumably still at Privet Drive, along with most of his possessions from his first year at Hogwarts. The question of how to retrieve these items, or whether they needed to be retrieved at all, had been dancing around the edges of conversations for days without anyone quite knowing how to address it directly. "Actually," Petunia said quietly from her place at the breakfast table, "I brought Harry's key with me. It was in his trunk when we left." She pulled a small golden key from her purse and handed it to Harry with a tentative smile. "I thought you might need it." Harry stared at the key, surprised by this small thoughtfulness. In all his years at Privet Drive, he couldn't remember his aunt ever thinking ahead to his needs, ever considering what he might require for his own life. This tiny gesture felt monumentally significant. "Thank you," he said simply, and meant it. Ginny, who had been practically vibrating with excitement for the past week, could barely contain herself as they prepared to leave. At 11 years old and finally going to Hogwarts, she radiated the kind of pure joy that made everyone around her smile just by proximity. "I can't believe it's really happening," she said, for the 10th time that morning, clutching her Hogwarts letter like a talisman. "I'm actually going to Hogwarts. I'm going to see the Great Hall, and the moving staircases, and the ghosts, and everything." "And you're going to learn magic," Ron added, with the fond exasperation of an older brother who had heard similar excitement from his siblings many times before. "Actual magic, Ginny. Spells and potions and transfiguration." "I know!" Ginny spun in a circle, her red hair flying out around her. "I'm going to learn everything. I'm going to be the best student Hogwarts has ever seen." Harry watched this display with growing warmth. It was strange to think that just a month ago he had been dreading the return to school, not because he didn't love Hogwarts, but because it meant leaving the Burrow, leaving the first real family he'd ever known. Now, the prospect of going to school with Ron and Ginny, of having a home to return to for holidays, made the entire experience feel different, better, like something to anticipate rather than endure. The journey to London went smoothly, with Mr. Weasley meeting them at the Leaky Cauldron as planned. He looked slightly frazzled from his morning at the ministry, but his eyes lit up when he saw the excited faces of his children and Harry. "Right then," he said, rubbing his hands together with enthusiasm. "Shall we brave the crowds of Diagon Alley? I warn you, it's going to be busy today. Last-minute school shopping always brings out half of magical London." Diagon Alley was indeed bustling with activity. Families hurried between shops with arms full of cauldrons, books, and robes, while owls hooted from their cages and parents called after children who had wandered off to press their noses against the windows of the joke shop or the Quidditch supply store. The familiar sights and sounds of the magical street filled Harry with a deep contentment that had nothing to do with the shopping and everything to do with being there as part of a family. Their first stop was Gringotts, where Harry needed to withdraw money for his school supplies. As they approached the marble steps of the Wizarding Bank, Harry felt a flutter of nervousness that had nothing to do with the goblins inside. "What if there are questions?" he asked quietly as they climbed the steps. "About why I'm not with the Dursleys, or who's responsible for me now, or—" "Then we'll answer them honestly, Mr. Weasley said firmly. "Harry, you're part of our family now. If anyone has a problem with that, they'll have to go through me." The goblin who handled Harry's account withdrawal was professional and efficient, showing no interest whatsoever in the family dynamics of his customers. Harry was relieved to find that his vault key worked perfectly and that his account remained untouched, containing more than enough gold to cover his school expenses, and then some. Their next stop was Madame Malkin's robes for all occasions, where both Harry and Ginny needed to be fitted for new school robes. Harry had grown significantly over the past year, and his old robes were now embarrassingly short in both the sleeves and hem. "My goodness," Madame Malkin said as she measured Harry. "You've shot up like a weed, haven't you? And put on some weight too, I'd say. Good to see. Too many students come in here looking half-starved." Harry felt his cheeks flush at the observation. But when he glanced at Mrs. Weasley, she was beaming with pride rather than embarrassment. It was another small reminder of how different his life was now, how basic things like adequate food and care were no longer uncertainties to be worried about, but simply part of the fabric of daily life. Ginny's fitting took considerably longer, partly because she needed a complete set of robes rather than just replacements, and partly because she kept getting distracted by the other customers and the general excitement of being measured for real Hogwarts robes. "I'm going to take such good care of them," she told Madame Malkin earnestly. "I'm going to hang them up every night and make sure they never get wrinkled, and I'm never going to spill anything on them. Ever. I give it a week, Ron said cheerfully. 2 at the most before you manage to get something colourful splashed down the front. Ronald, Ginny protested, but she was laughing as she said it. From Madame Malkin's, they made their way to Flourish and Blots, where the chaos of back-to-school shopping was at its peak. Parents and children crowded the narrow aisles, reaching for textbooks and comparing required reading lists, while harried shop assistants tried to maintain some semblance of order. Harry and Ron collected their second-year books with the practiced efficiency of students who had done this before, while Ginny stared in wonder at the towering shelves of magical knowledge surrounding her. "Look at all of them," she breathed, running her fingers along the spines of the books. "There are so many books here. You could spend your whole life reading and never get through them all." "That's the idea," Percy said, appearing at her elbow with his own stack of advanced textbooks. "Magic is a vast subject, Ginny. The more you read, the more you'll realize how much there is still to learn." It was as they were paying for their books that the first real complication of the day arose. The wizard behind the counter, a thin man with greying hair and spectacles, looked at their purchases with a frown of confusion. "I'm sorry," he said, glancing between Harry and the Weasley family, "but I need to confirm payment authorization. For Mr. Potter's purchases, I mean. Are you his legal guardian, Mr. Weasley?" The question hung in the air like an unexpected thundercloud. Arthur and Molly exchanged a quick glance, and Harry felt his stomach drop as he realized this was exactly the sort of bureaucratic complication they had been hoping to avoid. "Harry is staying with our family, Mr. Weasley said carefully, with the full knowledge and approval of Professor Dumbledore." The shop assistant looked uncertain. "I see. It's just that our records show his legal guardians as Vernon and Petunia Dursley of Little Whinging, Surrey. If there's been a change in custody arrangements, we'll need to see the proper documentation." "There's been no formal change in custody," Petunia said quietly, stepping forward with a composure that surprised Harry. "Harry is my nephew, and I gave permission for him to stay with the Weasley family. If you need a guardian's signature, I can provide it." The shop assistant looked relieved to have found a solution that fit within his understanding of proper procedure. "Of course, Mrs. Dursley, Petunia Dursley." She signed the required forms with a steady hand, and Harry noticed that she signed her name as Petunia Evans Dursley, including her maiden name in a way she had never done before. The rest of their shopping proceeded without incident. They visited the apothecary for potion ingredients, where the smell of dried herbs and preserved creatures made Ginny wrinkle her nose. Ollivander's, where Ginny was fitted with a beautiful wand made of yew and phoenix feather that seemed to sing with happiness when she held it. And finally the magical menagerie, where Ron spent a considerable amount of time trying to convince his parents that he desperately needed a new pet to replace his aging rat, Scabbers. "Absolutely not," Mrs. Weasley said firmly, when Ron lingered hopefully near a cage of young owls. "Scabbers is perfectly fine, and we're certainly not buying another pet when we can barely afford the ones we have." "But Mum," Ron protested, "Scabbers is getting old. He sleeps all the time, and he's not very friendly, and—" "He's been in our family for 12 years, Mrs. Weasley interrupted. "He's not going anywhere." Harry, who had been examining a display of owl treats, found himself thinking about Hedwig, still safely housed in her cage back at the Burrow. His beautiful snowy owl had adapted well to her new surroundings, seeming to understand instinctively that this was a place where magical creatures were welcome and valued rather than merely tolerated. As they prepared to leave Diagon Alley, their arms full of packages and their pockets considerably lighter, Harry realized that something fundamental had shifted in the way he thought about returning to school. For the first time in his life, Hogwarts felt like a bridge between one home and another, rather than an escape from misery or a temporary reprieve from loneliness. "Are you nervous?" Ginny asked, as they settled into their seats for the journey back to the Burrow. "About going back to school, I mean?" Harry considered the question. Was he nervous? Yes, but not in the way he had been in previous years. This nervousness was different. It was the anticipation of showing Ron and Ginny his favourite places in the castle, the excitement of introducing Ginny to nearly headless Nick and the moving staircases, the simple joy of sharing something he loved with people he cared about. "A little," he admitted. "But mostly I'm excited. This year feels different." "Different how?" Ron asked, looking up from the chocolate frog card he'd been examining. Harry smiled, watching the Devon countryside roll past the train window as they headed home to the Burrow. "Different because I'm not going alone," he said simply. "This year, I'm going with my family." And as Ginny's face lit up with delight, and Ron grinned with the satisfaction of a best friend whose family had just been claimed as family in return, Harry knew that whatever challenges the new school year might bring, he would face them with something he'd never had before: the absolute certainty that he was loved, wanted, and that he had a home to return to when it was all over. King's Cross Station on September 1st was a chaos of steam, luggage, and families saying tearful goodbyes. But for Harry Potter, walking through the crowded concourse with the Weasley family, it felt like the most natural thing in the world. For the first time in his life, he was heading to platform 9 3/4, not as a reluctant burden being grudgingly delivered to school, but as a beloved member of a family who would genuinely miss him. Petunia walked beside him, her face a mixture of wonder and apprehension as she took in the bustling, magical families around them. At 42, she had spent most of her adult life denying the existence of magic, turning her face away from anything that reminded her of her sister's world. Now, surrounded by witches and wizards making no attempt to hide their nature, she looked like someone seeing the world with new eyes. "It's remarkable," she said quietly, watching a family nearby whose luggage was floating obediently behind them. "How many of you are there? How many magical people living right alongside us without us ever knowing?" "More than you might think," Arthur Weasley replied kindly, adjusting his grip on Ginny's trunk. "We've gotten quite good at blending in when necessary, though I must say, it's refreshing to be somewhere we don't have to pretend." Harry noticed the way Petunia's eyes tracked the casual use of magic around them. A mother mending her son's torn robes with a flick of her wand, an owl perched calmly on a luggage trolley, a group of teenagers comparing what appeared to be moving photographs. There was something almost hungry in her expression, as if she were trying to absorb as much as possible of this world she had spent so many years rejecting. "Nervous, Ginny?" Ron asked his sister, who was practically bouncing on her toes with excitement, despite the early hour. "Nervous? Me?" Ginny laughed, her 11-year-old face bright with anticipation. "Ron, I've been dreaming about this day since I was 6 years old. I'm not nervous, I'm absolutely bursting." Mrs. Weasley smiled fondly at her only daughter, though Harry could see the glimmer of tears in her eyes. "Just remember everything we've taught you about staying safe, sweetheart. Don't wander off on your own, especially in the first few weeks, while you're still learning your way around. And don't believe everything Fred and George tell you about the school," Percy added seriously, appearing beside them with his headboy badge gleaming on his robes. At 16, he carried himself with the sort of dignity that suggested he took his new responsibilities very seriously indeed. Half of what they say about Hogwarts is complete nonsense designed to worry first years. "Only half?" Harry asked with mock surprise. "You're being generous, Percy." As they approached the barrier between platforms 9 and 10, Harry felt a familiar flutter of anticipation mixed with something new, the warm certainty that he belonged here, that this magical world was his world, and that the people around him were truly his family. "Right then," Arthur said, checking his watch. "We'll go through in groups. Harry, since you've done this before, would you mind taking Ginny through first? Show her how it's done?" Harry nodded, turning to Ginny with a grin. "The trick is not to be scared of hitting the barrier," he said, remembering his own terror on his first attempt. "Just walk straight at it, don't slow down, and trust that it'll work." "I'm not scared," Ginny said firmly, though Harry could see her knuckles were white where she gripped her trolley handles. Lily Potter's nephew wouldn't have a coward for a friend. The casual way she claimed friendship with him, the easy reference to his mother, made something warm unfurl in Harry's chest. He offered Ginny his arm. "Together then?" They ran at the barrier side by side, and Harry felt the familiar sensation of cool darkness enveloping them before they burst through onto platform 9 3/4. The Scarlet Hogwarts Express stood waiting, steam billowing from its chimney, while hundreds of students and families filled the platform with noise and motion. Ginny stopped dead, her eyes wide with wonder, as she took in her first sight of the legendary platform. "Oh," she breathed. "Oh, Harry, it's exactly like I imagined, but somehow so much more real." "I know what you mean," Harry said, understanding completely. "It never quite feels real until you're actually here." The rest of the family appeared moments later, with Petunia emerging from the barrier, looking slightly green but determined. She stood very still for a moment, taking in the sight of the platform 9 3/4, the Hogwarts Express, the casual magic happening all around her. "Lily stood here once," she said quietly, so quietly that Harry almost missed it. 16 years ago, she stood right here, probably just as excited as Ginny is now. Harry felt his throat tighten with emotion. In all the years he'd known Petunia, she had never spoken about his mother with anything approaching fondness. To hear her now, imagining Lily as a young witch boarding the Hogwarts Express for the first time, was almost overwhelming. "She was probably terrified and thrilled all at once," Petunia continued, her voice growing stronger. "She wrote to me after her first day, you know. Told me all about the moving staircases and the ghosts and the sorting hat. I was so jealous I threw the letter away without finishing it." She looked at Harry with eyes that were bright with unshed tears. "I wish I'd kept it. I wish I'd kept all of them." "Aunt Petunia," Harry began, but she shook her head. "No, let me say this. I need to say this." She took a deep breath, steeling herself. "Your mother would be so proud of you, Harry. Not because you're famous, not because of what happened when you were a baby, but because of who you've become, despite everything. You're kind and brave and good, just like she was." Before Harry could respond, a commotion near the train interrupted them. A harried-looking wizard in official ministry robes was consulting a clipboard and looking around the platform with obvious frustration. "Excuse me," the wizard called, approaching their group. "I'm looking for Harry Potter. I'm from the Student Records Office at the Ministry. There's been some confusion about his guardianship documentation for this term." Arthur and Molly exchanged a quick glance, and Harry felt his stomach drop. After weeks of relative peace, the bureaucratic complications of his situation were finally catching up with them. "I'm Harry Potter," Harry said, stepping forward. The wizard consulted his clipboard again. "Yes, well, the issue is that our records show your guardians as Vernon and Petunia Dursley of Little Whinging, Surrey, but the Hogwarts administration received notification that you'd be staying with the Weasley family of Ottery St. Catchpole for the foreseeable future. We need to clarify the legal situation before you can board the train." "I'm Petunia Dursley," Petunia said firmly, stepping up beside Harry. "Harry is my nephew, and I have every right to determine his living arrangements. He's staying with the Weasley family with my full permission and approval." The wizard looked relieved to find someone who seemed to fit within his understanding of proper procedure. "Ah, excellent. If you could just sign these forms confirming the arrangement." "Actually," Petunia interrupted, "I'd like to make a more formal change. I want to transfer guardianship to myself alone, removing my husband from any legal authority over Harry's care." This clearly was not what the wizard had expected. He consulted his clipboard again, looking flustered. That would require a formal hearing with the Wizengamot, Mrs. Dursley. It's not something that can be arranged on a train platform." "Then arrange it," Petunia said calmly. "In the meantime, I'm Harry's aunt and closest living relative. I'm giving permission for him to live with the Weasley family and attend Hogwarts under their care. If you need something in writing, I'll be happy to provide it." Harry stared at his aunt in amazement. This was not the timid woman who had spent 15 years deferring to Vernon's every decision. This was someone who had found her voice and her strength, and was using both to protect him. The wizard scribbled frantically on his forms. "Yes, well, that should suffice for now. We'll be in touch about the formal hearing. Mr. Potter, you're cleared to travel." As the wizard hurried away, looking relieved to have the situation temporarily resolved, Mrs. Weasley enveloped Petunia in a warm hug. "That was beautifully done," she said warmly. "You're a lioness when you need to be, aren't you?" Petunia smiled, looking slightly surprised by the praise. "I'm learning to be." The warning whistle sounded, and suddenly the platform erupted into a frenzy of final goodbyes. Harry found himself swept up in a round of hugs that left him breathless and grinning. "Write to us," Mrs. Weasley said fiercely, holding him tight. "Every week, Harry. I want to know how you're getting on. Take care of our Ginny," Arthur added with a smile. "She's nervous no matter what she says." "I am not nervous," Ginny protested, but she hugged Harry just as tightly as everyone else. "Thank you for being my friend," she whispered. "Thank you for letting me be part of your family, too." Ron clapped him on the shoulder. "See you in a few minutes, mate. Save us a compartment." Finally, it was Petunia's turn. She approached him hesitantly, as if still not quite sure of her place in this new dynamic. Harry didn't hesitate. He stepped forward and hugged her, surprising them both with the genuine warmth of the embrace. "Thank you," he said quietly. "For everything. For coming to get me. For standing up to Vernon. For being here now. For choosing me." "Oh, Harry," Petunia's voice was thick with emotion. "I should have chosen you years ago. I should have chosen Lily. But I'm choosing you now, and I'll keep choosing you for as long as you'll let me." As Harry climbed aboard the Hogwarts Express, his trunk and Hedwig safely stowed, he turned to wave goodbye through the window. There on the platform stood the Weasley family, his family, waving and calling out last-minute advice and declarations of love. And there beside them stood Petunia, tears streaming down her face, but smiling as she watched him go. For a moment, Harry was overwhelmed by the contrast with previous years. He thought of his first journey to Hogwarts, alone and friendless, not even knowing that Platform 9 3/4 existed. He thought of last year, grudgingly dropped off by the Dursleys who couldn't wait to be rid of him. Now, he was leaving behind a real home and a real family who would miss him while he was gone and welcome him back when he returned. The difference was so profound, it made his chest ache with gratitude. "Come on, Harry," Ron called from the corridor. "Let's find a compartment before they're all taken." As the train pulled away from the platform, gathering speed as it headed north toward Scotland, Harry settled into a seat beside Ron and across from Ginny, who was staring out the window in wonder as the London suburbs gave way to countryside. "You know what?" Harry said, watching the familiar landscape roll past. "I think this is going to be the best year yet." Ron grinned. "With our family behind us? Definitely." And as Ginny pressed her nose to the window and began planning out loud all the things she wanted to see and do at Hogwarts, Harry felt a deep contentment settle over him. For the first time in his life, he was going to Hogwarts not as an escape from an unhappy home, but as a temporary departure from a place where he was truly loved. The knowledge that he belonged somewhere, that he had people who cared about him and would fight for him, made all the difference in the world. The Hogwarts Express carried them north toward their magical education, but more importantly, it carried them toward a future where Harry Potter was no longer alone. Severus Snape stood in the shadowed alcove outside the Great Hall, his black eyes fixed on the Gryffindor table, where Harry Potter sat laughing with the Weasley siblings. At 32, Snape had mastered the art of observation without detection, a skill that served him well in his dual roles as potions master and Death Eater spy. But this morning, watching the boy who bore James Potter's face, but Lily Evans's eyes, he found his carefully maintained composure disturbed by something he couldn't quite define. Potter was different. It wasn't merely the physical changes, though those were evident enough. The boy had grown over the summer, filling out his robes with a healthier frame that spoke of regular meals and proper care. His unruly black hair caught the morning light streaming through the enchanted windows, and his green eyes, Lily's eyes, held a brightness that Snape didn't remember seeing before. No, the difference was deeper than mere physical improvement. Potter carried himself differently, moved with a confidence that hadn't been there the previous year. When young Weasley had made some jest that set the entire group laughing, Potter's response was immediate and genuine, not the cautious reaction of a boy accustomed to walking on eggshells around those who were supposed to care for him. Snape's fingers tightened involuntarily around the scroll of parchment he'd been studying, the official notification from the Ministry's Student Records Office regarding changes to Potter's guardianship arrangements. The bureaucratic language couldn't mask the reality. The boy had been removed from his relatives' care and placed with the Weasley family, with the full approval of both Dumbledore and his surviving guardian, Petunia Evans Dursley. The irony was not lost on him. Petunia, who had spent her childhood resenting her sister's magical abilities, who had watched Lily's acceptance to Hogwarts with a mixture of envy and disdain, had apparently found the courage to protect Lily's son when it mattered most. The sister who had called them freaks had ultimately chosen the magical world over the mundane cruelty of her husband. "Professor Snape?" Snape turned sharply, his black robes billowing around him, to find Minerva McGonagall approaching with her characteristic brisk stride. The Transfiguration Professor's expression was unreadable, but there was something in her eyes that suggested she had observed his surveillance of the Gryffindor table. "Minerva," Snape replied coolly, tucking the ministry notice into the folds of his robes. "How may I assist you?" "I was wondering if you'd had a chance to review the changes to our student records," McGonagall said, her voice carefully neutral. "Particularly regarding young Mr. Potter's living arrangements." Snape's expression remained impassive, but inwardly he tensed. McGonagall had always been perceptive, perhaps too much so. "I am aware of the situation," he said finally. "And what is your assessment?" The question was deceptively simple, but Snape recognized the weight behind it. As head of Slytherin House and a member of the teaching staff, his opinion on matters affecting student welfare carried significance. More importantly, McGonagall was one of the few people at Hogwarts who understood the complicated nature of his relationship with Harry Potter, though she could never know the full truth of his motivations. "The boy appears—" Snape paused, choosing his words carefully. more settled. Whatever circumstances led to the change in his guardianship, they seemed to have been beneficial. McGonagall's expression softened slightly. Indeed, Arthur and Molly Weasley are exemplary guardians. Their own children are proof enough of that. Snape found himself studying Potter again, noting the way the boy's attention was currently focused on helping young Ginevra Weasley, 11 years old, and radiating excitement about her first weeks at Hogwarts, with what appeared to be a piece of particularly challenging homework. There was nothing calculated in Potter's assistance, no awareness that he was being observed. It was simply kindness, offered freely and without thought of reward. Lily's kindness. The observation struck Snape with unexpected force. How many times had he watched Lily help struggling students in precisely the same way? How many times had she offered assistance with that same unconscious generosity, that same lack of pretense? Severus? McGonagall's voice cut through his reverie. Are you quite all right? Perfectly, Snape replied curtly, annoyed at having been caught in a moment of vulnerability. If you'll excuse me, I have preparations to make for this morning's lessons. As Snape swept toward the dungeons, his mind churned with uncomfortable thoughts. For 11 years he had protected Harry Potter out of duty to Lily's memory, a penance for the role his information had played in her death. But his protection had been distant, invisible, offered without warmth or acknowledgement. He had watched the boy struggle with the Dursleys' neglect, told himself that the blood protection was worth any temporary unhappiness, that Dumbledore's plan took precedence over the child's immediate well-being. Now, seeing Potter surrounded by genuine family warmth, laughing freely and offering help without fear of reprisal, Snape was forced to confront an uncomfortable truth. He had been complicit in prolonging the boy's suffering, not through action, but through inaction, through choosing the abstract concept of protection over the reality of a child's daily misery. The first-year potions class that afternoon included Ginevra Weasley, and Snape found himself paying closer attention to her interaction with her fellow students than he normally would have bothered with new Gryffindors. The girl was bright, he grudgingly admitted, with a natural aptitude for potion-making that reminded him uncomfortably of her late aunt. When she successfully completed her forgetfulness potion on the first attempt, a feat that usually took students several tries, he awarded Gryffindor House 5 points with a reluctance that didn't go unnoticed by his Slytherin students. "Sir?" Draco Malfoy raised his hand, his pale face twisted with confusion. "Did you just give points to Gryffindor?" "Your hearing appears to be functioning adequately, Mr. Malfoy," Snape replied coldly. "Miss Weasley has demonstrated competence rare among first-year students. Talent deserves recognition, regardless of house affiliation." The explanation was accurate as far as it went, though Snape didn't examine too closely his real motivations for acknowledging the girl's success. She was Potter's adopted sister now, part of the family that had given him the care and affection he should have received all along. In some convoluted way, praising her felt like a small gesture toward the debt he owed Lily's memory. That evening, Snape found himself in the unusual position of seeking out Dumbledore in the headmaster's office. The conversation that followed was careful and oblique, touching on Potter's improved demeanor without directly addressing the implications. "The boy seems more confident," Snape observed, accepting a cup of tea he didn't particularly want. "Less guarded." Dumbledore's blue eyes twinkled with something that might have been satisfaction. Indeed, the love of family can work remarkable transformations, Severus. Harry is finally experiencing what it means to be wanted rather than merely tolerated. And the protection? The blood magic? Weakened, certainly, but not eliminated entirely. Petunia's willingness to act on Harry's behalf, her choice to prioritize his well-being over her husband's prejudices, has actually strengthened certain aspects of the protective charm. Love, freely given, has its own power. Snape set down his teacup with perhaps more force than necessary. You speak as though this was always the plan. Not the plan, no, Dumbledore admitted quietly, but perhaps what should have been the plan from the beginning. I allowed fear to override compassion, Severus. I told myself that Harry's temporary unhappiness was acceptable if it kept him alive. I was wrong. The admission hung between them like a physical thing. Snape had expected justification, explanation, the usual careful maneuvering that characterized Dumbledore's approach to difficult truths. He had not expected such direct acknowledgement of failure. The Dark Lord will learn of this change eventually, Snape said finally. He has followers who monitor such things, who watch for weaknesses in our defenses. Indeed he will, Dumbledore agreed. And when that happens, your position becomes more precarious than ever, my dear fellow. You will need to be very careful about how you present this information, how you frame your knowledge of Harry's new circumstances. Snape's expression darkened. The reminder of his dual loyalties was unwelcome but necessary. As a Death Eater spy, he was expected to gather intelligence on Potter, to report anything that might be useful to Voldemort's eventual return. The Dark Lord's obsession with the boy who had destroyed his body was well known among his followers. Any change in Potter's circumstances would be of intense interest. But how could he explain his detailed knowledge of the situation without revealing the depth of his concern for Potter's welfare? How could he justify knowing about the boy's improved health and happiness without admitting that he had been watching, assessing, perhaps even caring about outcomes that should have been irrelevant to a loyal Death Eater? I will manage, Snape said finally, though privately he wondered if that was true. As he made his way back to the dungeons, Snape reflected on the impossible complexity of his situation. For 11 years, he had walked a knife's edge between competing loyalties, protecting Potter while maintaining his cover as Voldemort's spy. He had told himself that his motivations were clear. He protected the boy out of love for Lily, out of guilt for his role in her death, out of necessity for maintaining Dumbledore's trust. But watching Potter laugh with his newfound family, seeing the confidence that came from knowing he was loved and wanted, Snape was forced to confront a more uncomfortable possibility. Perhaps his protection of the boy had evolved beyond mere duty to Lily's memory. Perhaps, in some way, he didn't fully understand or want to acknowledge, he had come to care about Potter's well-being for its own sake. The thought was deeply disturbing. Caring about someone made you vulnerable, gave your enemies leverage against you. It was a weakness he could not afford, especially not with Voldemort's eventual return always looming on the horizon. But as he settled into his private chambers and tried to focus on grading the day's essays, Snape found his thoughts returning again and again to the sight of Potter helping young Weasley with her homework, offering assistance with Lily's own generous spirit. The boy was becoming more like his mother with each passing day, and that resemblance was both a blessing and a curse for the man who had loved her and failed to save her. Severus Snape closed his eyes and tried to prepare himself for the challenges ahead. Protecting Harry Potter had never been simple, but with each day that passed, it was becoming increasingly clear that the task was far more complicated than he had ever imagined. And somewhere in the darkness of the dungeons, surrounded by the tools of his trade and the weight of his secrets, Snape made a silent promise to the memory of Lily Evans. Whatever came next, whatever dangers emerged from the shadows of the past, he would find a way to keep her son safe. Not just alive, but truly safe, surrounded by love and family and all the things that made life worth living. It was, perhaps, the least he could do. And perhaps, if he was very careful and very lucky, it might even be enough. The first snow of December was falling softly outside the Burrow's crooked windows when Harry stepped through the fireplace, brushing emerald flames from his robes and breathing in the familiar scents of home. After 4 months at Hogwarts, the warm chaos of the Weasley kitchen felt like stepping into a welcoming embrace, complete with the sound of Mrs. Weasley humming Christmas carols as she wrestled with what appeared to be a turkey the size of a small dragon. "Harry!" Ginny's voice, carried from somewhere upstairs, followed immediately by the thundering of feet on the crooked staircase. She appeared moments later, her red hair flying behind her, and her face bright with excitement. At 11, she had grown more confident during her first term at Hogwarts, though she still retained the infectious enthusiasm that made everything seem like an adventure. "Ginny," Harry said, catching her in a hug that nearly knocked them both off balance. "How are you? How was your first term, really?" "Brilliant," Ginny exclaimed, pulling back to beam at him. "Absolutely brilliant. Professor McGonagall said my transfiguration work was exceptional, and I've already read ahead in all my textbooks. And Hermione Granger, you know, from your year. She's been helping me with study techniques. And—" "Breathe, Ginny," Ron interrupted, emerging from the kitchen with a piece of Mrs. Weasley's fudge in each hand. "You'll pass out from excitement before Christmas even gets here." Harry grinned at his best friend, noting that Ron had grown at least 2 inches over the term, and was now almost as tall as Percy. At 12, Ron was still all elbows and freckles, but there was something more settled about him now, a confidence that came from knowing his place in the world and feeling secure in his friendships. "Where's everyone else?" Harry asked, looking around the kitchen that seemed somehow smaller and cozier than he remembered, though no less welcoming for all that. "Dad's at work until this evening," Mrs. Weasley said, emerging from behind the enormous turkey with flour in her hair and a smudge of cranberry sauce on her cheek. "Percy's upstairs writing some sort of report for his ancient runes class. Honestly, that boy never stops studying. And the twins are supposedly helping, but actually plotting some sort of elaborate Christmas surprise that's going to give me grey hair." "What about Aunt Petunia?" Harry asked, suddenly realizing he hadn't seen her yet. "Garden," Mrs. Weasley said with a fond smile. "She's helping Arthur with the winter preparations. She's become quite the gardener, actually. Amazing what a person can accomplish when they're not spending all their energy being afraid." Harry found his aunt in the Burrow's back garden, wrapped in a thick cloak and carefully tending to what appeared to be a patch of winter vegetables that definitely hadn't been there during the summer. She looked up when she heard his footsteps crunching on the frost-covered grass, and her face lit up with genuine pleasure at seeing him. "Harry," Petunia said warmly, rising from her crouch beside the vegetable patch and brushing soil from her gloves. "How was the journey home? Not too crowded on the night bus, I hope?" "It was fine," Harry said, still marveling at the casual way she spoke about magical transportation, as if she'd been part of the wizarding world her entire life instead of spending decades denying its existence. "What are you growing?" "Winter squash and Brussels sprouts, mostly," Petunia replied, gesturing to the neat rows of plants. "Arthur's been teaching me about magical gardening techniques. Did you know there are charms that can protect vegetables from frost, and others that can actually improve the flavor as they grow?" Her voice held a wonder that reminded Harry powerfully of Hermione discussing a particularly fascinating piece of magic. It was strange to see his aunt, the same woman who had once flinched at the mention of anything magical, embracing the wizarding world with such enthusiasm. "I never knew you liked gardening," Harry said. Petunia's expression grew thoughtful. "I always did, actually, but Vernon thought it was a waste of time. said we should just buy our vegetables from the shop like civilized people. He never understood that some people find peace in growing things, in nurturing them and watching them flourish. She paused, looking at Harry with eyes that held years of regret. I think I'd forgotten that myself, until I came here. As they walked back toward the house together, Harry noticed that Petunia moved through the magical chaos of the burrow with an ease that would have been unthinkable just months earlier. She stepped around a garden gnome without flinching, nodded politely to a garden witch that was tending to some late-blooming roses, and didn't even blink when a flock of Christmas wrens burst into spontaneous song as they passed. "How are you really doing, Aunt Petunia?" Harry asked quietly as they approached the kitchen door. "Are you happy here?" Petunia stopped walking and turned to study his face, as if trying to memorize it. "Happier than I've been in 20 years, she said simply. "Happier than I thought I had any right to be, after everything I put you through." She reached out and touched his cheek gently. "You're thriving, Harry. You look healthy and content and loved. That's all I ever wanted for you, even when I was too frightened and bitter to show it." The following days passed in a blur of Christmas preparations that bore no resemblance to any holiday Harry had ever experienced. The burrow transformed itself into a festive wonderland, with garlands that sang carols when touched, Christmas puddings that glowed with their own internal light, and decorations that rearranged themselves whenever someone wasn't looking directly at them. Harry threw himself into the preparations with enthusiasm, helping Mrs. Weasley with the cooking, and learning that he actually had a talent for pastry making, assisting Arthur with stringing magical lights around the house, and joining the twins in their increasingly elaborate attempts to create the perfect Christmas surprise. Even Petunia found herself swept up in the festivities, contributing her own non-magical but deeply appreciated touches to the celebration. "I can't remember the last time I enjoyed Christmas this much," she confessed to Mrs. Weasley as they worked together to prepare Christmas dinner. At Privet Drive, it was always such a production. Everything had to be perfect, presentable, exactly what the neighbors would expect. "This is so much more real." Mrs. Weasley smiled warmly. "That's the difference between performing happiness and actually living it," she said. "One exhausts you, and the other fills you up." Christmas morning dawned crisp and clear, with fresh snow covering the countryside around the burrow like a clean white blanket. Harry woke early in Ron's room, listening to his best friend's gentle snores and marveling at the pile of presents that had appeared at the foot of his bed during the night. Real presents, wrapped with care and chosen with thought, more than he'd received in all his previous Christmases combined. When the family gathered in the sitting room to exchange gifts, Harry felt overwhelmed by the sheer abundance of love and thoughtfulness surrounding him. There were hand-knitted jumpers from Mrs. Weasley, his first in Gryffindor colours, a compass that always pointed toward home from Arthur, joke products and sweets from the twins, a book of advanced transfiguration theory from Percy, and from Ron, a collection of chocolate frog cards featuring famous Quidditch players. But it was Ginny's gift that nearly brought tears to his eyes, a small, framed photograph of his parents that she'd somehow obtained from Professor McGonagall, showing James and Lily Potter laughing together in what appeared to be the Hogwarts grounds during their 7th year. "I thought you should have something of theirs that showed them happy," Ginny said quietly, as Harry stared at the moving photograph, watching his parents' faces light up with joy and love. "Professor McGonagall said she took this picture herself, just a few months before they graduated." "Thank you," Harry managed, his voice thick with emotion. This is perfect." Petunia's gifts were perhaps the most surprising of all. For Harry, she had compiled a photo album of his mother's childhood, pictures that Vernon had insisted be thrown away years ago, but that she had secretly kept, hidden in an old jewelry box in the attic. Page after page showed Lily Evans growing up, from a gap-toothed 7-year-old performing accidental magic to a beautiful young woman in her Hogwarts robes. Every image chosen to show the sister Petunia had loved before fear and jealousy had poisoned their relationship. "I should have given you these years ago," Petunia said, as Harry turned the pages with reverent care. "They belong to you, not hidden away in my guilty conscience." For the Weasley family, Petunia had prepared a different sort of gift, legal documents that formally transferred a portion of her savings to help with the family's expenses, along with a letter explaining that it was the least she could do for the people who had given her nephew the love and family she should have provided all along. "Mrs. Dursley," Arthur began, clearly moved by the gesture. "We can't possibly accept—" "You can and you will," Petunia said firmly. "Consider it back payment for 15 years of room and board that Harry should have had with people who actually wanted him. As the day progressed, filled with an enormous Christmas dinner, crackers that produced live white mice instead of paper hats, and a snowball fight that lasted until well after dark, Harry found himself constantly amazed by the simple joy of being part of a real family celebration. There were no cruel jokes at his expense, no locked doors or missed meals or reminders that he was unwanted. Instead, there was laughter and warmth and the absolute certainty that he belonged here, that he was loved and wanted and valued for exactly who he was. That evening, as the family gathered around the fireplace to share stories and sing carols, Harry caught sight of himself in the mirror above the mantelpiece. The boy looking back at him bore little resemblance to the thin, frightened child who had once hidden in his cupboard on Christmas morning while the Dursleys celebrated without him. This Harry was healthy and confident, surrounded by people who cared about him, secure in the knowledge that he had a real home and a real family. "Happy?" Ron asked quietly, settling beside him on the sofa with a cup of hot chocolate. Harry smiled, looking around at the chaotic warmth of the Burrows' sitting room, at Ginny curled up in Arthur's lap while he read her a story, at Petunia teaching Mrs. Weasley a Muggle carol, at the twins attempting to teach Percy how to juggle, unsuccessfully, at all the people who had become his family, not through obligation or duty, but through choice and love. "Happier than I ever thought possible," Harry said simply. And as the firelight danced across the faces of the people he loved most in the world, Harry Potter finally understood what Christmas was supposed to feel like. Not perfect, perhaps, but perfectly real, filled with love and laughter and the kind of joy that came from knowing you were exactly where you belonged. Outside, the snow continued to fall softly over the Devon countryside, blanketing the Burrow in peaceful white. Inside, the warmth of family and the glow of the fire created a sanctuary from the cold world beyond, a place where love was freely given and gratefully received, where Christmas morning meant waking up wanted rather than merely tolerated. For Harry, it was the first Christmas of his real life, and it was everything he had ever dreamed a Christmas could be. The knock on the Burrows' front door came at 8 o'clock sharp on a grey February morning, accompanied by the sound of multiple official voices and the crunch of heavy boots on the frost-covered garden path. Harry, who had been helping Mrs. Weasley prepare breakfast before his return to Hogwarts for the spring term, felt his stomach drop as he recognized the officious tone of authority that he'd learned to fear during his years with the Dursleys. "Arthur," Mrs. Weasley called quietly, her face pale as she peered through the kitchen window at the group of stern-faced Muggle officials gathered outside their door. "I think you need to see this." Arthur Weasley appeared from the sitting room, still in his dressing gown but immediately alert. Behind him came Petunia, her face set in grim lines of determination, and Harry, whose 12-year-old frame had tensed with instinctive anxiety at the sound of potential trouble. The lead official was a thin woman in a severe grey coat, flanked by 2 constables and what appeared to be a social services representative. She consulted her clipboard with the sort of mechanical efficiency that suggested this was merely another case to be processed, another domestic situation to be resolved according to proper procedure. "Mrs. Petunia Dursley?" the woman asked when Arthur opened the door, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "I'm Inspector Williams from the Surrey Child Protection Services. We have a warrant for the immediate return of Harold James Potter to his legal guardians in Little Whinging." Arthur's expression hardened, though he kept his voice carefully polite. "I'm afraid there's been some misunderstanding, Inspector. Harry is here with the full permission of his aunt, and under the authority of—" "With respect, sir," Inspector Williams interrupted. "Mrs. Dursley's estranged husband has filed a formal complaint alleging child abduction and endangerment. According to our records, Vernon Dursley remains Harold's legal guardian, and Mrs. Dursley has no authority to remove the child from his care without proper court proceedings." Harry felt the familiar sensation of the world tilting beneath his feet, the same helplessness he'd experienced countless times when Vernon's authority had been used as a weapon against him. But before he could fully process his fear, Petunia stepped forward, her chin raised and her eyes blazing with protective fury. "My husband," she said, her voice carrying a steel that Harry had never heard before, "has no moral or practical authority over Harry's welfare. If you'd like to know why, Inspector, I'd be happy to provide you with 15 years' worth of documentation regarding his treatment of my nephew." Inspector Williams consulted her clipboard again, clearly unprepared for this level of resistance from someone she'd expected to be a compliant family member. "Mrs. Dursley, while family disputes are regrettable, the law is quite clear about custody arrangements. Unless you have formal court documents transferring guardianship—" "Actually," a new voice interrupted from behind the officials, "I believe you'll find the legal situation is somewhat more complex than your records indicate." The group turned to see Albus Dumbledore approaching through the morning mist, his purple robes billowing around him, and his mere presence seeming to charge the air with barely contained power. Behind him walked a stern-faced witch in official ministry robes, whose badge identified her as Amelia Bones, head of the Department of Magical Accidents and Catastrophes. "Professor Dumbledore," Inspector Williams said uncertainly, clearly recognizing something authoritative in his bearing despite his unconventional appearance. "I'm not sure what relevance. Harry Potter," Dumbledore said quietly, "is under the protection of the Ministry of Magic, Inspector Williams. His guardianship arrangements fall under our jurisdiction rather than yours, due to certain unique circumstances surrounding his safety and welfare." Amelia Bones stepped forward, producing a scroll of official parchment that bore the seal of the Wizengamot. "This is a formal custody order issued by the highest court in our land," she said crisply. "It supersedes any Muggle legal proceedings regarding Mr. Potter's care." Inspector Williams stared at the document, clearly struggling to process this development. "I don't understand. Ministry of Magic? Wizengamot? These aren't legitimate legal entities. I assure you they are quite legitimate," Dumbledore said mildly. "The magical government of Britain has existed in parallel with your own for centuries, Inspector. We handle matters concerning our citizens according to our own laws, just as you handle matters concerning yours." "This is preposterous," one of the constables said, his face red with confusion and frustration. "You can't just claim jurisdiction over a British citizen Because you belong to some sort of cult or religious group? Watch, Amelia Bones said simply, and with a casual flick of her wand, she caused all their clipboards and paperwork to organize themselves into neat, floating stacks that hovered in mid-air while writing themselves in perfect copperplate script. The silence that followed was broken only by the gentle scratching of quills and the soft rustle of self-organizing documents. Inspector Williams stared at the floating papers with the expression of someone whose entire understanding of the world had just been fundamentally challenged. "Right," she said faintly. "Yes, I see. Magic, of course." "The situation is quite straightforward," Dumbledore continued gently. "Harry Potter is a wizard, Inspector. He has been under my educational authority since he was 11 years old, and under the protective authority of the Ministry of Magic since birth. Vernon Dursley's guardianship was a temporary arrangement that has now been superseded by more appropriate placements." "But surely," the social services representative said weakly, "you can't just ignore the proper legal procedures." "We're not ignoring them," Amelia Bones replied. "We're following the legal procedures that actually apply in this case. However, if you'd like to understand why Vernon Dursley's guardianship was terminated, I believe Mrs. Dursley has some relevant testimony to provide." All eyes turned to Petunia, who straightened her shoulders and began to speak in a voice that grew stronger with each word. The story she told was devastating in its quiet honesty. 15 years of systematic neglect and abuse, documented in precise detail that left no room for denial or rationalization. She described Harry's childhood locked in a cupboard under the stairs, the deliberate starvation and overwork, the emotional cruelty disguised as discipline. She explained Vernon's escalating violence, culminating in the installation of iron bars and the feeding slot that had finally driven her to action. She spoke of Dudley's casual cruelty, encouraged and enabled by Vernon's hatred of anything different or magical. "Vernon installed iron bars on a 12-year-old's bedroom window," Petunia said, her voice breaking slightly but remaining steady. "He cut a hole in the door and fed him like an animal. He told me it was discipline, that Harry deserved it for being unnatural. But I knew, I'd always known, that it was just cruelty dressed up as righteousness." Inspector Williams had gone progressively paler as Petunia spoke, her professional detachment cracking in the face of such systematic abuse. "Mrs. Dursley, these are very serious allegations. If what you're saying is true—" "It's all true," Petunia said simply. "Every word. And I have 15 years of guilt to prove it, because I stood by and let it happen when I should have protected him." "There are also these," Arthur said quietly, producing a folder of photographs that showed Harry's bedroom at Privet Drive. The bars, the locks, the cat flap, the general atmosphere of imprisonment that had characterized his living conditions. Inspector Williams examined the photographs with growing horror, her professional composure finally cracking completely. This is criminal negligence at minimum, possibly criminal endangerment. We'll need to open a full investigation immediately." "An investigation is already underway," Amelia Bones said crisply. "Vernon Dursley is currently being questioned by our auras, magical law enforcement, regarding his treatment of Harry Potter. Given the international implications of his abuse of the boy who lived, this matter falls under the jurisdiction of the International Confederation of Wizards, as well as our own courts." "Boy who lived?" Inspector Williams asked weakly. "Harry survived a killing curse as an infant," Dumbledore explained patiently. "He's something of a celebrity in our world, which makes Vernon Dursley's abuse of him a matter of international concern. The magical governments of 17 countries have been monitoring this situation since Harry's placement with the Dursleys." Harry listened to this exchange with growing amazement. He'd known, intellectually, that his treatment at the Dursleys had been wrong, but hearing it laid out in legal terms, abuse, neglect, endangerment, made the reality of his situation hit him with new force. These people, these officials who had terrified him with their authority, were now learning that Vernon's power over him had been an illusion all along. "What happens now?" Inspector Williams asked, clearly struggling to regain some sense of professional control over a situation that had spiraled far beyond her understanding. "Now," Amelia Bones said firmly, "Harry Potter continues his education under the protection of the magical authorities, in the care of people who actually love him and want him to thrive. Vernon Dursley will face the consequences of his actions through proper legal channels, and Mrs. Dursley will receive the support and counseling she needs to deal with her own victimization in this situation." "Victimization?" Petunia said, startled. "But I participated in—" "You were married to an abusive man who terrorized you into compliance," Amelia Bones said gently. "Abuse victims often enable their abuser's treatment of others as a survival mechanism. That doesn't make you equally culpable, Mrs. Dursley. It makes you another victim who found the courage to escape." As the officials prepared to leave, their paperwork magically completed and their understanding of the situation fundamentally altered, Inspector Williams turned back to Harry with something approaching kindness in her expression. "Are you happy here, Harold?" she asked. "Do you feel safe and cared for?" Harry looked around at the people surrounding him, at Arthur and Molly Weasley, who had opened their home and hearts to him without question, at Petunia, who had found the courage to stand up to Vernon and choose love over fear, at Dumbledore and Amelia Bones, who had used their authority to protect rather than control him. "Yes," he said simply. "For the first time in my life, I'm actually happy." Inspector Williams nodded, making a final note on her remaining paperwork. "Then I think our work here is done," she said quietly. "Good luck, Harold. I hope you have the life you deserve from now on." As the officials departed, leaving the Burrow in its familiar, peaceful chaos, Harry felt something fundamental shift inside him. Vernon's power over him, the power that had defined his entire childhood, was finally, definitively broken. Not just challenged or temporarily suspended, but completely destroyed by forces that recognized his worth and were committed to protecting it. "Is it really over?" he asked Dumbledore, as they watched the official cars disappear down the lane. Dumbledore's blue eyes twinkled with something that might have been satisfaction. "Vernon Dursley's authority over you ended the moment Petunia chose love over fear, Harry. Everything else has just been paperwork." And as Harry looked around at the family that had chosen him, that had fought for him, that had stood between him and harm without being asked or expected to do so, he finally understood what it meant to be truly free. Free not just from Vernon's cruelty, but free to be loved, to be wanted, to be valued for exactly who he was, rather than what others expected him to be. The battle for Harry Potter's soul had been won not through magic or authority or legal proceedings, but through the simple, revolutionary act of unconditional love. And in the end, that had been more powerful than any weapon Vernon Dursley could have wielded against him. The ancient ritual chamber, deep beneath the Ministry of Magic, hadn't been used in over 3 centuries, its stone walls carved with protective runes that seemed to pulse with their own inner light. Harry stood in the center of the circular room, surrounded by some of the most powerful wizards in Britain, and tried not to think about how strange his life had become, that participating in blood magic rituals now felt almost normal. The old protection is not entirely lost, Dumbledore explained, his voice echoing softly in the stone chamber as he consulted a tome so ancient its pages seemed to whisper when turned. When you left Privet Drive, Harry, the charm weakened considerably, but it didn't break completely. Your mother's sacrifice created something deeper than a simple residential protection. It created a bond of love and blood that transcends location. Petunia stood beside Harry, her hand resting gently on his shoulder in a gesture that still felt wonderfully new to both of them. At 42, she looked different than she had during her years at Privet Drive, stronger, more confident, freed from the constant tension that had marked her life with Vernon. The magical world had embraced her not as an outsider to be tolerated, but as Harry's family, as someone whose love and protection were valued and needed. "I don't understand," Harry said, looking around at the assembled witches and wizards. Dumbledore, Minister Fudge, Amelia Bones, and several others he didn't recognize, but who carried themselves with the gravity of people accustomed to making decisions that affected entire nations. If the protection was tied to Privet Drive, how can it still work now? "Because," said a witch Harry didn't recognize, an elderly woman with silver hair who wore the robes of the Department of Mysteries. "Your mother's magic was never really about the house itself. It was about family, about blood willingly shared and protection freely given. What we're doing today is not creating new magic, Harry. We're allowing the magic that already exists to flourish as it was meant to." The ritual itself was surprisingly simple. No dramatic incantations or complex wand movements, no sacrifice or pain. Instead, Petunia was asked to place her hand over Harry's heart and speak a truth that had taken her 15 years to fully understand. "I choose you," she said, her voice steady and strong in the ancient chamber. "I choose to be your family, not because duty demands it or fear compels it, but because love makes it right. I choose to protect you as my sister would have done, as I should have done from the beginning." The response was immediate and unmistakable. The carved runes around the chamber flared to brilliant life, casting dancing shadows on the walls as magic older than recorded history recognized and accepted Petunia's declaration. Harry felt something warm and protective settle around him like an invisible cloak, a sensation of safety that reminded him powerfully of the feeling he got when Mrs. Weasley hugged him. "Remarkable," breathed the Department of Mysteries witch, making rapid notes on a scroll that seemed to write itself. "The resonance is actually stronger than the original charm. Love freely given versus obligation reluctantly accepted. The difference in magical potency is extraordinary." "What does this mean, exactly?" Petunia asked, though she didn't move her hand from Harry's shoulder. "What kind of protection have we created?" Dumbledore smiled, his blue eyes twinkling with something that might have been relief. "It means, my dear Petunia, that your nephew is now protected by something far more powerful than the original blood charm. Before, the protection was defensive. It prevented direct magical attack while Harry was at Privet Drive. Now, it's active and expansive. Anyone who loves Harry, and whom he loves in return, contributes to his protection, wherever he might be." "The Weasley family," Harry said suddenly, understanding. "That's why you wanted them here too." Indeed, Arthur and Molly Weasley stood at the edge of the circle, along with Ron and Ginny, all of them part of the magical working simply by being present, by representing the family bonds that had grown between them and Harry over the past months. "Exactly," Dumbledore confirmed. "The Burrow is now as protected as Privet Drive ever was, perhaps more so, and you, Harry, carry that protection with you wherever you go, strengthened by every act of genuine love and care you receive. The implications were staggering. Harry thought about all the people who had come to mean family to him. The Weasleys, Petunia, even Hagrid and some of his professors at Hogwarts. Each relationship, each bond of affection, contributed to a protective network that no dark wizard could easily break. "But there's something else," the Department of Mysteries witch said, consulting her notes with evident excitement. "Something unprecedented in our records. Mrs. Dursley, when you made your declaration, you weren't just accepting Harry as family, you were also choosing to bridge two worlds, Muggle and magical, brought together through love rather than fear." Petunia looked puzzled. "I don't understand the significance of that." "Most protective magic is insular," Dumbledore explained gently. "It works within the magical community, among people who understand and can channel magical power. But you're a Muggle who has chosen to love and protect a wizard, not despite his magic, but including his magic as part of who he is. That acceptance creates a unique resonance." As if to demonstrate his point, one of the monitoring instruments in the chamber began humming with soft, musical notes that seemed to harmonize with some deeper frequency. "The protection now extends to shield Harry from both magical and Muggle threats," Amelia Bones observed, studying the readings with professional interest. Vernon Dursley's attempts to use Muggle authorities against Harry would have failed, even without ministry intervention. The magic itself would have turned their efforts aside, made them lose interest or find more pressing concerns elsewhere. Harry felt overwhelmed by the scope of what they had accomplished. For the first time since he'd learned about the magical world, he truly understood why his mother's sacrifice had been so powerful. It wasn't just about dying to save him. It was about choosing love in the face of absolute terror, about making that choice without reservation or condition. "Can I ask you something?" Harry said, looking up at Dumbledore with a question that had been bothering him for months. "Why didn't you tell me about the blood protection before? Why did I have to learn about it when it was almost too late?" Dumbledore's expression grew grave. "Because I was afraid, Harry. Afraid that if you understood the price of your protection, the necessity of remaining with people who didn't love you, you might choose to leave anyway. I thought I was protecting you by keeping you ignorant, but I see now that I was protecting myself from having to trust in your judgment and courage." "I might have left earlier if I'd known," Harry admitted, "but I also might have been able to help Aunt Petunia find her courage sooner. We might have avoided years of misery for both of us." "Indeed," Dumbledore agreed sadly. "I have made many mistakes in my long life, Harry, but few have caused as much unnecessary pain as my decision to keep you in the dark about your own protection. I promise you, no more secrets about your safety, no more decisions made without your knowledge and consent." The ritual was officially complete, but the group remained in the chamber for some time, discussing the practical implications of what they had accomplished. The Burrow would need new protective wards, keyed to the family bonds rather than simple location-based magic. Harry would need to understand how to recognize when the protection was active, how to know if it was being tested or threatened. But most importantly, Harry needed to truly understand what his mother had given him. Not just life, but the capacity for love that made life worth living. "Your mother knew," Petunia said quietly, as they prepared to leave the ancient chamber, "that the most powerful magic isn't in spells or potions or ancient rituals. It's in choosing to love someone more than you love yourself, in putting their well-being above your own safety or comfort." "She chose that with me," Harry said, thinking of the photographs Ginny had given him at Christmas, of his parents laughing together in what had turned out to be some of their last happy moments. "Yes," Petunia agreed, "and now you get to choose it too." every day, with everyone who becomes part of your family. That's the real gift she gave you, Harry. Not just protection from dark wizards, but the ability to create the kind of love that's worth protecting. As they emerged from the depths of the Ministry into the grey London afternoon, Harry felt fundamentally changed by what had taken place in that ancient chamber. Not just protected, but empowered. Not just safe, but free to make choices about his own life and relationships without constantly fearing that love would make him vulnerable. The blood protection had been transformed from a burden he carried unknowingly into a strength he could wield consciously. And at the centre of it all was a truth that Vernon Dursley had never understood and never would, that love, freely given and gladly received, was the most powerful force in either the magical or muggle world. Walking back to the Burrow with his family, all of them, muggle and magical alike, Harry Potter finally understood why Tom Riddle would never be able to defeat him. Not because Harry was stronger or cleverer or more powerful, but because Harry had something Voldemort had rejected and could never reclaim. The willing love of people who chose him as family, who protected him not out of duty, but out of joy. And that, Harry realized as the Burrow came into sight across the Devon countryside, was worth more than all the magic in the world. The protection was complete. More than that, it was perfect, not in the sense of being flawless, but in the sense of being exactly what it was meant to be. Love made manifest, family made eternal, and safety built not on fear or obligation, but on the unshakable foundation of hearts that had chosen each other freely and would defend that choice against anything that threatened it. Harry was home, truly and completely home, and nothing would ever change that again. Chapter 12. The end-of-term feast at Hogwarts had never felt quite like this before. Harry sat at the Gryffindor table, watching the last of the pudding vanish from the golden plates, while around him his classmates chattered excitedly about their summer plans. But for the first time since arriving at the castle, Harry felt no dread at the approaching holidays, no stomach-clenching anxiety about where he would spend the long weeks away from school. He was going home to the Burrow. Not being sent away, not being collected like an unwanted package, going home to a place where he belonged, where his room would be waiting for him, where Mrs. Weasley would probably already be planning elaborate meals, and Mr. Weasley would be eager to hear about his second year at Hogwarts. "You look like the cat that got the cream," Hermione observed from across the table, her own trunk packed and ready beside her. Over the course of the year, she had become a regular visitor to the Burrow for weekends and holidays, seamlessly absorbed into the Weasley family's elastic definition of belonging. "I'm just happy," Harry said, and the simple truth of it still surprised him sometimes. After 17 years of existing rather than living, the sensation of genuine happiness remained wonderfully novel. Ron grinned and clapped him on the shoulder. "Can't wait to get home, can you? Mum's been planning summer activities for weeks. She's got a whole list of places she wants to take us. Diagon Alley for new books, a trip to see Charlie in Romania, maybe even a holiday to the seaside if Dad can get the time off work." The casual way Ron said "us," including Harry without question or condition, never failed to warm something deep in Harry's chest. This was what family meant. Not obligation or duty, but the simple assumption that, of course, Harry would be included. Of course, his preferences and happiness mattered. Of course, he belonged in every plan and adventure. "Speaking of family," Hermione said with a slightly mysterious smile, "there's someone waiting to see you by the entrance doors, Harry." Harry looked up, confused, but before he could ask what she meant, he spotted a familiar figure standing near the great oak doors of the castle. Petunia Dursley, no, Petunia Evans, as she had legally changed her name back to after the custody hearing, stood talking quietly with Professor McGonagall, her hands clasped in front of her, and her usually severe expression softened by something that looked almost like maternal pride. "Aunt Petunia." Harry rose from the table, surprise and pleasure warring in his voice. "What are you doing here?" She turned as he approached, and Harry was struck once again by how much she had changed over the past year. The pinched, bitter expression that had defined his childhood memories of her had been replaced by something gentler, more open. She was still thin and sharp-featured, but now she looked elegant rather than severe, confident rather than brittle. "I came to collect you for the holidays," she said simply, as though it were the most natural thing in the world. I thought it might be nice if we travelled home together this time." Harry blinked, momentarily speechless. For 11 years, the end of term at Hogwarts had meant a solitary train journey back to Privet Drive, where he would be collected like luggage and transported to a house where he was barely tolerated. Now, not only was he going home to a place where he was truly wanted, but that journey would include the woman who had finally found the courage to choose love over fear. "I would like that very much," he said quietly. Professor McGonagall stepped forward, her usually stern expression warmed by obvious approval. "Miss Evans has been telling me about your summer plans, Potter. A trip to Romania sounds quite educational." Miss Evans still sounded strange to Harry's ears, but he was getting used to it. After legally severing all ties with Vernon Dursley and reclaiming her maiden name, Petunia had thrown herself into building a new life with the same determination she had once used to maintain Vernon's impossible standards. She had taken a small flat in Godric's Hollow, close enough to the Burrow to visit regularly, but independent enough to rebuild her sense of self, and had even begun tentative correspondence with some distant Evans relatives who had been estranged during her marriage to Vernon. "The arrangements have all been made," Petunia said, addressing Harry directly. "Arthur, Mr. Weasley, will be meeting us at King's Cross with the car. He's quite excited about the prospect of driving in London traffic again." Harry couldn't help but grin at that. Mr. Weasley's fascination with Muggle transportation had not diminished over the months, and he had become an unexpectedly enthusiastic driver, though his tendency to ask Petunia detailed questions about traffic lights and parking meters could make even short journeys quite lengthy. "Brilliant," Harry said, and meant it. The image of travelling home with both Petunia and Mr. Weasley, two people who had chosen to make him family, despite having no obligation to do so, filled him with a contentment that felt almost too large for his chest. As they made their way down to the carriages that would take them to Hogsmeade Station, Harry found himself walking between Ron and Petunia, with Hermione chattering animatedly about her summer reading plans ahead of them. The late June sunlight was warm on his face, and the grounds of Hogwarts were green and beautiful around them. But for once, Harry didn't feel the usual melancholy that came with leaving the castle. "Are you nervous?" Petunia asked quietly as they settled into their carriage. "About the summer, I mean." Harry considered the question seriously. A year ago, the prospect of 3 months away from school would have filled him with dread. Now, he felt nothing but anticipation for long days at the Burrow, for helping with the garden and playing Quidditch with Ron and Ginny, for Mrs. Weasley's cooking, and Mr. Weasley's enthusiastic explanations of Muggle technology. "No," he said finally. "I'm excited." Petunia smiled, a real smile, warm and genuine, and nothing like the tight, false expressions Harry remembered from Privet Drive. Good, that's exactly how it should be. The train journey to London was everything Harry had never known he wanted. Instead of sitting alone in a compartment, dreading his destination, he found himself part of an animated conversation that included not only Ron and Hermione, but also Neville Longbottom, who had become a regular part of their group over the course of the year. Petunia listened with obvious interest as they discussed their classes and professors, asking thoughtful questions and even laughing at Ron's increasingly dramatic reenactments of Professor Snape's more memorable moments. "He can't actually turn students into toads, can he?" she asked with genuine concern after Ron described a particularly colourful detention. "No, Aunt Petunia," Harry said, grinning, "though sometimes I think he'd like to." The easy way the title rolled off his tongue surprised them both. For most of Harry's life, Aunt Petunia had been a formal address, demanded by duty and grudgingly given. Now it felt unnatural, affectionate even, the acknowledgement of a relationship that had been redeemed through courage and love. When they reached King's Cross, Harry could see Mr. Weasley waiting on the platform before the train had even come to a complete stop. He was bouncing slightly on his toes with excitement, his red hair catching the afternoon sunlight, and his face lit up with the kind of uncomplicated joy that Harry had learned to associate with the Weasley family's approach to life. "Harry, Petunia, Ron, Hermione," he called out as they disembarked, as though he hadn't seen any of them in months rather than just the usual end-of-term period. "How was the journey? Did you try the chocolate frogs? I've been reading about railway catering, and apparently the modern dining car is a marvel of Muggle engineering." "Dad!" Ron interrupted with fond exasperation. "You can quiz us about trains in the car. Let's get the luggage sorted first." The process of loading trunks and owl cages into Mr. Weasley's ministry car was conducted with the cheerful chaos that Harry had learned to love about any Weasley family activity. Everyone helped with everyone else's luggage. Hermione carefully stowed Crookshanks in his carrier, while Hedwig hooted approvingly from her cage, and Mr. Weasley provided a running commentary on the improved suspension system he had been experimenting with in his spare time. "Right then," he said, as they all piled into the magically expanded car, "home to the Burrow for a proper welcome-home dinner. Molly's been cooking since dawn, and I believe there may be cake involved." As they pulled away from King's Cross and into the London traffic, Harry settled back between Ron and Petunia and felt a deep sense of rightness settle over him. This was what coming home was supposed to feel like, surrounded by people who loved him, heading toward a place where he was wanted, secure in the knowledge that whatever challenges lay ahead, he would face them with the support of a real family. "Comfortable?" Petunia asked quietly. "Perfect," Harry replied, and watched the familiar countryside roll by through the car windows. The Burrow looked exactly as Harry remembered it, tall and crooked, and seemingly held up by magic and love in equal measure, with smoke rising from the chimney and Mrs. Weasley's garden in full summer bloom. As they pulled into the yard, Harry could see Ginny and the twins waiting on the front step, obviously having been watching for their arrival. "Harry!" Ginny called out, bounding down the path as soon as the car doors opened. "Mum's made your favourite treacle tart, and Dad promised to show us his latest modifications to the car after dinner, and Charlie sent an owl saying he's definitely arranged for us to visit the Dragon Preserve, and—" "Ginny!" Mrs. Weasley's voice interrupted from the doorway, warm with laughter. "Let the poor boy get out of the car before you overwhelm him with the entire summer schedule." Harry grinned and submitted to Mrs. Weasley's enthusiastic embrace, breathing in the familiar scents of her cooking and the gentle lavender soap she always used. Over her shoulder, he could see Petunia watching with a soft expression that spoke of wonder and gratitude, and perhaps just a touch of wistfulness for all the years when this kind of welcome hadn't been possible. "Come on then," Mrs. Weasley said, releasing Harry but keeping one arm around his shoulders as she turned to include Petunia in her greeting. Dinner's ready, and I want to hear all about your term. Arthur's been driving me mad with questions about your defense against the dark arts classes, and I've been dying to know how you got on with Professor McGonagall's advanced transfiguration work." As they all trooped into the Burrow's warm, chaotic kitchen, Harry caught Petunia's eye and saw his own contentment reflected there. This was what they had built together over the past year. Not just Harry's rescue from an unloving home, but the creation of something entirely new. A family that was chosen rather than simply inherited. Bonds that were strengthened by love and commitment rather than mere blood relation. The dinner table at the Burrow had been magically expanded to accommodate everyone, and Harry found himself sitting between Ron and Petunia, with the twins across from them providing running commentary on everything from Quidditch League standings to their latest business ventures. Mrs. Weasley kept piling food onto everyone's plates. Mr. Weasley asked detailed questions about every subject Harry had studied, and Ginny regaled them with tales of her own first year at Hogwarts. "And how did you find Professor Snape this year, Harry?" Petunia asked during a brief lull in the conversation. "You mentioned in your letters that he seemed different." Harry considered the question thoughtfully. His relationship with his potions master had indeed evolved over the course of the year, though it would be an overstatement to call it friendly. Snape remained sharp-tongued and demanding, but Harry had begun to notice a subtle shift in how those criticisms were delivered, less like genuine cruelty and more like the challenging expectations of a teacher who believed his student was capable of meeting high standards. "He's still difficult," Harry said diplomatically, "but I think he's trying to be fair. He's never going to be warm and fuzzy, but he's not actively horrible anymore." "That's something, at least," Petunia said with a small smile. "Your mother always said he was brilliant, just, complicated." The casual reference to Lily Potter no longer sent the sharp pang of grief through the room that it once had. Over the months, Petunia had begun to share memories of her sister more freely, and Harry had learned to treasure these glimpses into a past he had never known. They were gifts, these stories, small pieces of his parents that helped build a more complete picture of who they had been beyond their tragic end. After dinner, as Mrs. Weasley bustled about, clearing dishes, and Mr. Weasley disappeared into his shed to tinker with some new Muggle artifact, Harry found himself sitting in the garden with Petunia, while Ron and Ginny argued good-naturedly over a game of chess nearby. "Are you happy?" Petunia asked suddenly, her voice quiet but intent. Harry looked at her in surprise. It was such a simple question, but one that would have been almost impossible to answer just a year ago. Now, surrounded by the sounds and sights of the Burrow in summer, Ron's laughter, the gentle hum of magical creatures in the nearby woods, the warm glow of lamplight from the kitchen windows, the answer came easily. "Yes," he said simply. "I really am." Petunia nodded, as though this confirmed something important. "I spent so many years being afraid," she said quietly. "Afraid of magic, afraid of Vernon's anger, afraid of not being good enough or normal enough or safe enough. I let that fear make me cruel to you, and I'll regret that for the rest of my life." "Aunt Petunia," Harry began, but she held up a hand. "Let me finish," she said gently. "I can't change what I did, but I can make sure it never happens again. You're safe now, Harry. You're loved and wanted and protected, and you always will be. That's a promise." Harry felt tears prick at his eyes, not from sadness but from the overwhelming relief of hearing words he had waited his entire life to hear. "Thank you," he said quietly. "For everything. For being brave enough to leave Vernon. For bringing me here. For fighting for me." "Your family," Petunia said simply, as though that explained everything. and perhaps it did. As the evening settled around them, and the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Harry looked around at the scene before him. Ron and Ginny still absorbed in their chess game, the twins' voices drifting from the kitchen where they were helping their mother with some elaborate dessert preparation. Mr. Weasley's pleased exclamations echoing from his shed, and Petunia sitting quietly beside him, finally at peace. This was his life now, not the life he had been born to, with parents who loved him but died too soon, and not the life he had endured for 11 miserable years with relatives who saw him as a burden. This was the life he had chosen, and that had chosen him in return, a life built on love and acceptance, and the revolutionary idea that family was defined not by blood alone, but by the commitment to care for one another, no matter what challenges might come. Tomorrow, he would help Mrs. Weasley in her garden and listen to Mr. Weasley explain the theoretical mechanics of Muggle automobiles. Next week, he would travel to Romania with Ron and Ginny to visit Charlie and see dragons up close. Next month, he would return to Hogwarts for his 3rd year, secure in the knowledge that he had a real home to return to during every holiday. But tonight, he was exactly where he belonged, surrounded by people who loved him unconditionally and completely. For Harry Potter, who had spent most of his life believing he was fundamentally unworthy of love, it was the greatest magic of all. The summer stretched ahead of them, bright with possibility and warm with the promise of family, and Harry had